Talk a little bit about what insulin resistance is.
Basically, every time you eat a meal, you're going to release insulin. There are many processes that insulin control.
So one of the challenges with the term insulin resistance is, as you said, it's a vague term and it's non-specific.
There are two problems in diabetes. One is you don't make enough insulin. The other is you're insulin resistant.
Type 2 diabetes.
Pretty bad.
You're knocking on death's door.
Correct.
You're going to go blind.
Yep.
You're going to have your toes amputated. You're not ever going to have an erection again. And you're going to die of cardiovascular disease or kidney disease or Alzheimer's disease quickly.
Some people say that Alzheimer's disease is, diabetes type 3. I'm not sure I
Brain
agree.
diabetes. Yeah.
Yes. You are obese when you're 4 years of age. You're going to be obese when you're an adult.
And your life expectancy will be significantly shorter.
Decreased.
And your quality of life will be significantly reduced. What has changed so much in the last 30 years that has created this epidemic? Hey everyone, welcome to the Drive Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Attia. Ralph, thank you so much for coming down to, up to Austin from San Antonio. Very excited to sit down with you and talk about, potentially one of the most important subject matters in all of health. People who listen to me all the time hear and are familiar with me talking about these four horsemen, right? Cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative and dementing diseases. And then there's this fourth horseman that I talk about, and it's in many ways the squishiest because it's not the one that shows up on the most death certificates. But in many ways, it's the foundational one that is amplifying the risk of all of those other causes of death. And I refer to it as, sort of metabolic disease spanning the spectrum from hyperinsulinemia to insulin resistance to fatty liver disease, all the way out to type 2 diabetes. So given how much I speak about that, it seems very important that we should have a really thorough discussion of that foundational metabolic disease, and no one better than you to have that discussion. So let's start a little bit with just kind of telling folks briefly about, what you're doing at UT San Antonio and why you've spent the last almost 50 years now working on this problem.
So for me, I actually have been sort of in this field of metabolic disease for a long time. I think I'm the longest consecutively funded 53 years NIDDK investigator. And I actually started even long before that when I was a medical student at Harvard. I had this fantastic teacher, Professor Cahill, who gave us all of the lectures on intermediary metabolism, and I decided this is what I wanted to do, and I worked each summer with Professor Cahill, and sometimes in life you meet the right person, the right opportunity, it changes everything you do, and basically what I do now, I contribute directly to George. And when I gave the Banting lecture in 2008, people usually, put a picture of their mother and father and children. And I love my mother and father and children, but I only showed one picture, and that was Professor Cahill, because he's really the person who's ended up sort of directing me to where I am today.
People who are listening, who are particularly astute, might recall I've referenced a number of Cahill's papers, but one of the more interesting studies he did, which it's possible he did while you were even a student there, was the 40-day starvation study. Now, you might have not been quite at Harvard yet, because this was, if I recall, in the mid-60s, maybe 66, 67, and it was probably a group of medical students that actually volunteered, if not medical students, undergrads, and they did a water-only fast for 40 days. And the study basically just followed all of the metabolites, what happened to glucose levels, obviously insulin, beta-hydroxybutyrate acetoacetate. Anyway, it was very fascinating stuff. One of the things that was most interesting to me in that study was even under a period of such extreme starvation, the brain never gave up its dependency on glucose. So even though ketone bodies began to service the brain by about day 7 to 10 as the majority of the fuel, even at 3 and 4 weeks of starvation, glucose was, if my memory serves me correctly, still providing about a third of the brain's energy.
Your memory is very good. The brain did switch over to ketone metabolism, and believe it or not, I didn't do the 40-day fast, but I was one of the people who fasted for 5 to 7 days. And if you fasted for 3 days, you could get paid $50. And I thought I was the richest guy in the world from this study. So I can assure you that the physical specimens in this study were phenomenal.
What did the 40-day fasting students get?
I don't know, but I'm sure he paid them a lot of money.
That's amazing.
In order to do that. The interesting thing about that is you realize that we have so much energy stored in the human body. Who would have thought that, you're a lean type person, you can, fast for 40 days. But the real problem is at some point, you start to break down muscle.
Yep.
And then if you start to break down cardiac muscle, then prolonged fasting at that point becomes a problem. But you have a lot of energy stored in fat, and you can starve for a long time. And obese people easily can go for 3-4 months with all of the reserves that are in the body.
Well, let's maybe talk a little bit about what insulin resistance is. We'll get into what causes it, but let's just maybe define for people this term that gets thrown around constantly,
Yep.
and let's explain what it is from a technical standpoint.
Yeah. So basically, every time you eat a meal and your blood sugar level goes up, you're going to release insulin. And insulin is sort of a master regulator for all biochemical processes in the body. So one of the things that insulin is going to do is going to talk to your muscles. They're going to say, take up glucose and burn that glucose. So what we need to know is, in a normal person, when I infuse insulin, how much of the glucose is taken up by the muscle. And then we could look at someone who is, say, overweight, or we could look at someone who's diabetic. And I actually developed the gold standard technique, which is the insulin clamp technique, to look at this. So we could take an obese person or a diabetic or a normal person, we raise the insulin, and then I'm using muscle as an example. How much glucose is taken up disposed of by the muscle, and then I can compare if you're overweight compared to the lean person. Well, obese people are very insulin resistant in terms of muscle glucose uptake. I could look at the diabetic. They're even more insulin resistant. But there are many processes that insulin control. So insulin regulates how much fat is released from your fat cells. And obese people, unfortunately, insulin keeps the fat in your fat cell. But in obese people, insulin doesn't work so well. So instead of keeping the fat in the fat cell, even though your insulin is high, you're breaking down the fat. So you have to look at each individual process that insulin is controlling. And so for that process, we know this is what a normal person should respond like. This is what a diabetic responds like, and the diabetic is much, much more insulin resistant. They're not responding. So it's, in a certain way, it's a general term because insulin controls so many things. Protein metabolism. Insulin is very important in helping you to build protein. So I could infuse insulin, and we've done this using carbon-labeled leucine, and we can define how insulin promotes protein metabolism in a normal, healthy person. And then I could do the same kind of study in an obese person, and we know that the obese people don't respond to the insulin as well in terms of aggregating protein metabolism. So it's kind of a general term.
And does that translate not just to structural proteins such as enzymes or cellular structural proteins, but also macro structural proteins such as muscle?
Absolutely. So I can look at specific enzymes within the cell. I can look at certain genes within the cell that are turned on or off, or I can look at muscle in terms of muscle as a bulk. So there are many, as I said, many ways in which you could define insulin resistance, but basically whatever the particular process you're looking at, you're comparing what would be the normal response in a normal healthy person compared to what might happen in a diabetic person or an obese individual.
So one of the challenges with the term insulin resistance is, as you said, it's a vague term and it's non-specific because the actions of insulin are so many.
Yes.
It has an action in the liver, it has an action in the muscles, it has an action with response to glucose, it has an action with response to amino acids, and it has an action with response to fat, both in the liberation of fat, lipolysis, and presumably in response to oxidation.
Absolutely.
And we'll go through all of these, but let's maybe start with how the euglycemic clamp test is done.
Yeah.
And let's assume that I'm a healthy enough individual that we can use me as a proxy. I come into your clinic. What are we going to do? How do you run this test?
Yeah. So let me bring you back in time when I was a fellow, because at that time, we didn't really have a good measure of insulin sensitivity. So what people would do is you do an oral glucose tolerance test.
Yes.
And the insulin level would go up. And so then some people would say, I'll look at how much insulin comes out compared to the rise in glucose. And that's a measure of beta cell function. And then someone would just turn it around and say, look, I'm going to see how much the rise in glucose was per insulin, and that's a measure of insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very clear to me, well, this is insane. You can't take two variables and then, just depending upon how you want to look at them, switch denominator and numerator. And so I said, we need to develop something that is really more specific.
And just to be clear, Ralph, I mean, unfortunately, we as clinicians are not able to do euglycemic clamps.
Correct.
So we are still looking at oral glycemic tolerance tests. We are still giving people, oral glucose and sampling glucose and insulin every 30 minutes and trying to impute what we can, which I'd love to come back and talk about interpretation, but carry on with the limitation.
We could do that because we actually have done a lot of work on how you interpret that. So what we said is, why don't we develop a serious way? And so we developed a technique where I could take 100 people and I would infuse insulin initially as a priming dose and then just clamp the insulin level. So I give a prime continuous insulin infusion. I can take 100 people, and all 100 people, I can raise your insulin level by 100 microunits per ml. And I can do that for 2 hours. And now I know that the stimulus, the insulin stimulus, whether you're lean, whether you're obese, or whether you're diabetic, whatever particular process that I want to look at. So maybe I wanted to look at how insulin shut down hepatic glucose production. And actually, we were the first people to ever use radioisotopes to trace this and show that in normal people, insulin shut down glucose production by the liver very quickly. But obese people and diabetics were very, very resistant to the insulin. And then we said we wanted to know, look, everybody now has got the same insulin level. How effectively does that insulin stimulate muscle glucose uptake? And again, what we showed, and these actually were the very first unequivocal demonstration that diabetic people, type 2, were insulin resistant. Before this, there was a lot of controversy. Dr. Reven, who's sort of the father of insulin resistance, I like to think I'm the son of Dr. Reven. He's a great idol of mine. He really was one of the very first people to insinuate that diabetics were insulin resistant. But now with the insulin clamp, we showed this very definitively. And we also know we use labeled glycerol and free fatty acids, and we could show the ability of insulin to shut down release of lipid from the fat cell was markedly impaired. So 3 of the major organs, all of this work originally was done by us when I was back at Yale.
So let's summarize those again.
Yep.
We're talking about this in an insulin-sensitive person. Right out of the gate, insulin is going to shut down hepatic glucose output.
Absolutely.
So which again, all of this kind of makes sense if you think through the pathway. Our liver is constantly putting glucose into circulation because the muscles can't put glucose into circulation. So
Right.
something has to feed the brain.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
if insulin is high, it suggests glucose is already sufficiently high. So let's not create more glucose toxicity. Let's shut that.
Yep.
The second thing it's going to do is it's going to take that excess glucose and put it in the place where we have the largest capacity to store it, which is muscle.
Absolutely.
So point 2
Perfect.
is we increase muscle uptake of glucose. And then point 3, you said, was it's going to shut down lipolysis.
Yes.
It's going to shut down the release of triglycerides and or free fatty acids from the adipose tissue.
Yep. And that's very critical. And we also, when we did these studies, we would put a catheter in the hepatic vein and in a femoral artery and a femoral vein. So we could look at the individual tissues. And what we showed is that when you infuse insulin, say 80 or 90% of the glucose is going to be taken up in muscle. Only 10% is going to be taken up in the adipocyte and stored. And so,
how much in the liver?
Basically none. Under euglycemic conditions, and we were the first to show this conclusively as well, there's no glucose uptake in the liver by insulin.
Just explain to people what a euglycemic condition means.
Yeah, euglycemic means your fasting glucose when you wake up in the morning is 80. Now you're euglycemic. That means when we do the studies, we keep your fasting glucose of 80. We don't let the glucose change. All we're going to do is raise the insulin.
And that means you're giving glucose.
Of course, because if we didn't give glucose, then your blood sugar level would drop, and then you'd release cortisol, you release epinephrine.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure people understand that. I was going to come back to that, but I wanted you to finish that point. So let's make sure we go back to the test, because it's very counterintuitive. So I've got a catheter in each arm. I walk in off the street. I've been fasting. My blood sugar is 80 or 90, whatever milligrams per deciliter it is. You are going to have to infuse both insulin and glucose into each of my arms. Right. And the reason is, when you said a moment ago, you're going to steadily increase my insulin and take it to a steady state of 100 IU per
microunit per ml.
Yep. That's a staggeringly high insulin level.
Not so high. In your eye, after a meal, it would be maybe 60. Obese people very commonly get to 100.
Sure. For a healthy person, they would never see an insulin level that high. Right. And if you were not simultaneously running glucose into them, you would kill them within minutes.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, but just to get to the point of, they would become so profoundly hypoglycemic that they would cease to exist.
And it should be obvious that if you're very sensitive to insulin, I have to infuse a lot of glucose. But the other beauty of it, as I said, when I was a young guy at Yale, there was a physician in New York, Dr. Altshuler. He was the first one to use tritiated glucose to trace metabolic pathways. And I said, oh, this is astounding. So I actually went to visit Dr. Altshuler and learned how he did it. And so all of the insulin clamp studies that we did, we were the first people to use tritiated glucose in humans, and to show that the ability of insulin to shut down the release of glucose from the liver was markedly impaired. And this is
sorry to interrupt, but just make sure that people are following us. The reason you wanted to use tritiated glucose there was not to quantify the total amount of glucose disposal. You could do that on mass balance.
Yeah.
You wanted to determine the ultimate fate of glucose.
Correct.
How much became hepatic glycogen, if any? It sounds like the answer is none. How much became muscle glycogen? Sounds like you said about 90%. And how much ultimately got converted through de novo lipogenesis into adipocyte or free fatty acid? Sounds like that's about 10% under the euglycemic condition. Is that correct?
Yeah, in general, that's correct, except in the muscle, remember, some of the glucose is going to be oxidized. So if you look at the glucose once it gets into the cell, 1/3 would go through the glycolytic pathway and be oxidized.
Right away.
Yes, and the other 2/3 would be stored as glycogen.
Now, what if the person is, presumably you're doing this test and a person is sedentary?
Yes.
So how is muscle, is muscle that metabolically active at rest? I guess it is.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. Does that mean you're increasing energy expenditure under these conditions?
Well, of course, in a certain way you are, but it's not like when you go out and you exercise and you run a mile or two. I would say you are turning on a number of cycles, which are, of course, going to increase energy expenditure. You're generating ATP, so there is a certain increase in energy expenditure. But if I really want to increase energy expenditure, I'd get you to go jog 5 miles or so, because exercise is really the thing that really increases energy expenditure.
And Ralph, just for a sense of amount, if you're doing this in, say, somebody my size who's insulin sensitive, how many actual grams of glucose would you be able to get into the person within the hour whilst keeping insulin clamped.
Yeah. So I'm going to do it first in terms of rates, the
Okay.
way we express it, and then I'll translate that. So it's under basal conditions, you wake up in the morning and your liver is producing and your tissues are taking up about 2 milligram per kilogram body weight per minute. Okay?
Sorry, say that again. Liver is producing, that's hepatic glucose output.
That's hepatic glucose output, 2 milligram per kilogram body weight per minute.
Yep.
And we were the first to actually show this many years ago. And this is humans. Mice are very, very different, totally different. And that's why extrapolating from mice to humans can be a problem.
Let's just reflect on that for a second. People who listen to this podcast are probably sick of me saying this, but I'm sorry, I just can't stop saying it. The liver never ceases to amaze me. Right? Like, I mean,
it's an incredible organ.
It's an unbelievable organ. And again, I come back to this idea. It's the only major organ for which we don't have extracorporeal support. Right?
Interesting. Yeah.
If your heart, if you went into cardiogenic shock and we felt we could, reverse it in time, we could put an intra-aortic balloon pump in you. We could put an IABP in you. We could put a left ventricular device in you to stem you over until we get you out of there. If your kidneys are destroyed, we can transiently dialyze you. Even if your brain is experiencing swelling, we can put enough steroids in you or decompress your skull to give you the time to recover and keep you alive otherwise. You go through all the major organs. If your spleen is dinged, take it out, right? Even if you lost your small bowel, we could at least transiently keep you alive with, TPN or something like that. None of this is true with the liver.
In the old days, they actually used to use pig liver perfusion.
I know.
But that was in the old days. We don't do that anymore. And
baboon as well.
And baboons. Yeah.
So again, the fact that the liver can titrate this amount is remarkable. So 2 milligrams per kilogram per minute. So you take an individual who weighs 100 kilograms, you're putting 200 milligrams per minute of glucose into circulation.
And then you can multiply that by however minutes you want to look.
So that's a gram every 5 minutes.
Yep.
That's 12 grams of glucose every hour that the liver is putting out.
But now when I do an insulin clamp, depending on how much I raise the insulin, and over the years, we've done a dose response curve, and I can come back to this because your fat is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. If I raise the insulin just by 10 microunits per ml, the fat stops producing free fatty acids and glycerol. You inhibit lipolysis literally completely. The liver, you need to get the insulin up to about 50 microunits per ml to really get it shut down.
Sorry, and the fat you had to get how high?
10. A rise of 10.
And tell me, these people, when they come in and healthy, they're at what? They're at 5 to 10 fasting?
Yeah, they're at 5 to 10.
Yeah.
So I'm going to raise them from 5 to 10 to maybe 15 or 20, and that's going to, in large part, shut down lipolysis, okay? And in fact, all of this sort of work was work that we originally did many, many years ago. Now, at the level of the liver, you really need to get up to about 50 microunits per ml. So maybe at 10, I'm going to bring you up to 50, and that's in large part going to shut off glucose production by the liver. Now, that's critical because, you wake up in the morning and your liver's producing glucose. Now, if you eat a meal, glucose is coming in from the gastrointestinal tract. You can't have glucose coming in from the liver at the same time. Otherwise, you get very hyperglycemic. So when you eat a meal and that insulin comes out, it really needs to shut down hepatic glucose production. Now, what's replacing the liver is what's coming from the meal. But then after you absorbed all of the meal, the liver needs to turn back on. So understanding how the liver is responding to insulin is really very important. And then if I want to look at what's going on in the muscle, the reason why we go to 100 microunits per ml, which is, it's above physiologic, but it's still within the physiologic range. And you really need to get, if you really want to stimulate muscle glucose uptake completely in a normal healthy person, you'd probably have to get the plasma insulin to about 200 microunits per ml. But in reality...
I'm sorry, at 200 what happens?
You have now maximized muscle glucose uptake. But in reality...
Even in an insulin-sensitive person?
Yes.
And just to make sure I understand what you're saying that if you took an insulin-sensitive individual at 100 units of insulin versus 200, you will actually drive more glucose uptake. You haven't saturated
Correct.
the GLUT4 transporter at 100.
Yeah, probably about 20 or 25% more uptake as you go from 100 to 200.
Wow.
And these are all early studies that we did. So when we talk about insulin resistance, that's why I said you need to know which tissue you're talking about and which metabolic pathway. And if you want to talk about enzymes, you need to talk at what specific enzyme, because insulin resistance needs to be related to the tissue you're talking about and the process within the tissue that you're talking about. So insulin resistance is a very important concept, but you all have to be a little bit more specific about what aspect you want to address. So you can have insulin resistance in the fat cell, you can have insulin resistance in the liver, you can have insulin resistance in the muscle, and then something that's now pretty exciting is you may have insulin resistance in the brain. And there's suggestions now, and there are many insulin receptors in the brain. Jesse Roth, very famous diabetes person, maybe 50 or 60 years ago was the first to describe insulin receptors in the brain. And this is an area that's now starting to unfold. It may have some relationship to neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's disease. Some people say that Alzheimer's disease is, diabetes type 3. I'm not sure I agree.
Brain diabetes.
Yeah. Yes. So that insulin resistance is a very important concept. And unfortunately, I would say let's say we're going to talk about diabetes. Even though there's an ominous octet that I developed that's used everywhere in the world for the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes, if we really wanted to take and solidify it and say, what are the two big concepts? Insulin resistance would be here. Yep. On the other hand would be impaired beta cell function, okay? So if you are insulin resistant and your beta cells work well, they know how to read the insulin resistance. They'll make enough insulin. You won't become diabetic. The hyperinsulinemia can damage you in other ways, but you won't become diabetic. But what happens is if you're insulin resistant, and particularly if you have a genetic predisposition, if your beta cells have to continuously pour out insulin, they start to exhaust. And so insulin resistance is a disaster for someone who has a genetic predisposition. It's going to bring out the diabetes. Insulin resistance, in my opinion, is intimately related to cardiovascular disease. That is why when you see a diabetic patient, 10% of them, you walk in, you have diabetes, first time I see you, 10%, 15% of the people already have clinically significant cardiovascular disease. And if you look carefully, virtually 100% of them do.
And sorry, Ralph, do you think that is a result of the hyperinsulinemia or the untreated or poorly treated hyperglycemia?
All of the above. But more importantly, what we showed, and we were, again, the first people to show this, and the cardiologists, they're kind of hemodynamically oriented. They're looking at, vessels structurally collapsing.
Yeah, sure.
But if you look at the insulin signaling pathway, insulin has got to bind to its receptor. And then there's a signaling pathway. I can tell you all the molecules in there, which I'm not. And then glucose gets transported in the cell. We were the first people to show in humans that pathway doesn't work normally. Insulin will bind to the receptor. It will activate the receptor. But the next molecule, IRS1, PI3 kinase, all those molecules don't get activated. So glucose doesn't get into the cell. That's diabetes. That same pathway activates nitric oxide synthase, and that generates nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the most potent vasodilator in the human body. It's the most potent antiatherogenic molecule in the human body. So this defect that's in muscle, and it's in cardiac muscle, and it's in skeletal muscle. This is all human data that I'm talking about, not animal data. When you get a defect in that insulin signaling pathway, that's going to cause diabetes, and it's going to promote cardiovascular disease. And that is why you can never separate cardiovascular disease from diabetes. Now, as you pointed out, rightfully so, I believe that high levels of insulin are also atherogenic. Now, I don't want people saying Dr. DeFronzo said you shouldn't be giving insulin to people who need it. Of course, if people need insulin, you need to give them insulin. But our beta cells make 35 units of insulin per day. If you're a type 1 diabetic, and again...
Sir, what do you mean?
You're going to have your breakfast, you're going to have your lunch, you're going to have your dinner, and if I were to add
I'm sorry, 35 units. I thought you meant micro units.
No.
Got it. Yeah,
so
35
over the
total
course
units.
of the day, 35 units of insulin. So we showed this many years ago when I actually was at Yale, that if you were to take a type 1 patient and they were lean, they would only need 35 or 40 units of insulin to get their glucose controlled, assuming you gave the doses at the right time. But we have a lot of people who are taking 100 units of insulin, both type 1s and type 2s.
So 3x physiologic.
Yes. That kind of hyperinsulinemia, I think there's evidence to support that's atherogenic. But now we have a problem, okay? Can you have the glucose remain high?
Yeah, it's a question of, do you want to die quickly or slowly?
Because but we have really good drugs.
Yes. But
today,
if you were only doing this with insulin,
be a problem.
It's an awful trade-off. You're going to die very quickly from hyperglycemia if you're left untreated. But if we overdo it with insulin to maintain normal glycemia, we're going to kill you slowly.
It's a quagmire. You're stuck.
Yep.
You have to treat, but you also know that when you're giving these big doses of insulin, there may be some side effects.
This is something, Ralph, I don't think that has been necessarily appreciated by the medical community, has it?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, there has generally been an ethos of, when I've talked to patients with type 2 diabetes, that what they've been told is, I'm told to cover with as much insulin as is necessary to maintain my glucose levels in this range. And it means I can eat whatever I want. It's okay if I have all the pasta and bread and sugar in the world, because as long as I'm covering it with insulin, I'm okay. And then you find out, wow, you're taking 150 units of insulin a day in all of its forms, the short acting, the long acting, et cetera. But I didn't actually realize that what we would consider physiologic is 35. I may have known that at one point and I've since forgotten, but that's a great reference.
Yeah.
So basically, if there's a person with type 2 diabetes listening to us today, and they're taking 75 units of insulin, one of the takeaways should be, what do I need to do with my nutrition and other pharmacologic activities, plus exercise, plus everything that's under my control, to maybe get that down to 35, where I would be at a physiologic level?
Absolutely. There are things, as you already insinuated, weight loss, if you can get people to do it, exercise, and then we can add medications in combination with insulin, insulin sensitizers, or some drugs to help you lose weight that will all also allow you to get that dose of insulin, reduced. The other thing we showed in this study, Dr. Del Prado, who's past president of the European Diabetes Association, we took normal, healthy, lean kids, 18, 25 years of age, and we put them on the Clinical Research Center for 3 days, and we gave them a very, very low dose of insulin infusion. And we raised their fasting insulin from 8, which is what a normal person would be, to 20, which is really quite low. And within 48 to 72 hours, they were as insulin resistant as a type 2 diabetic patient. So hyperinsulinemia induces insulin resistance. This is unequivocal.
Wait a second. Why is that the case?
So what insulin does is it downregulates the insulin signaling transduction system. So that insulin, when it binds to its receptor and then it activates IRS1 and PI3 kinase and AKT, that system is downregulated by hyperinsulinemia. All of this that I'm telling you about, it's all published. These are all studies done in humans, and this also been shown in rodent models as well. So this is another reason why we don't want people to be hyperinsulinemic.
You have to explain that to me again, Ralph. That is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
I would never have predicted that. So let me say it back to you, because I feel like I missed it when I was writing something down.
Yeah.
You took normal volunteers who had a fasting insulin of 8.
Yep, and they're lean, healthy.
Okay, and You
Yum.
simply infused insulin in them, presumably with glucose.
Oh, yes, of course. On the clinical research center where we can monitor and keep the glucose perfectly constant. We're not letting the glucose change.
So person shows up, insulin 8, glucose is 90.
Yep.
You do a euglycemic clamp where you bring insulin up only
to
by
20.
1.5x to 20.
Much less than would be when you eat a meal.
Exactly. Not even a postprandial bump.
Correct.
But now it's constitutively sitting there at 20.
Yep.
And you've obviously had to bring glucose. You had to infuse glucose to maintain euglycemia.
Correct.
Did you say that in 4 days?
48 to 72 hours. And these people are as insulin resistant as type 2 diabetics.
Okay, again, very, very counterintuitive. Because if our model is that insulin resistance, which is the hallmark factor contributing to type 2 diabetes in the combination of beta cell fatigue, is driven by lipotoxicity, which we're going to come to.
That's an important one.
Yes.
Yep.
These people didn't have any of that.
No,
these people didn't have any of the intramyocellular lipid that we talked about with your colleague, Jerry Reven, as a predisposing factor.
It's the direct effect of insulin down-regulating the insulin signaling system and probably other distal metabolic within the cell as well.
Okay, so then when you turn the clamps off, let's just say we ran this for 72 hours.
Yeah.
We've made them functionally diabetic. Turn the clamps off. How many hours or days?
We didn't do that.
What would you predict?
I would predict probably within 24 to 48 hours they would return to normal because we did this acutely. Now, if we were able to do this for several months, then I would anticipate that the insulin resistance would remain for a long period of time. And remember, when we treat type 1 diabetics, we're always giving the insulin into the periphery. And you or I, when you ingest the meal, where does the insulin go? It goes into the portal vein. So the liver is seeing a high level of insulin. That's good. It says stop making glucose, but now it removes half of the insulin. So how much insulin gets into the periphery? Half of what you secreted. Why? Because we don't want the insulin in the periphery over-insulinizing the periphery because it would make the muscle tissue very insulin resistant. So the portal, the pancreas secreting insulin into the portal circulation, liver sees the insulin, good, stop making glucose, but it also takes up half of the insulin. So less insulin get enough to nourish the muscle, okay?
Yep.
Enough to shut down the fat-producing free fatty acids, but not enough to hyperinsulinize the system. And in a certain way, if you're a diabetic and you are insulin resistant, or an obese person and you are insulin resistant and you're hypersecreting insulin, it's kind of working against you because it's a reverberating system that's making the insulin resistance aggravated. So one of the big things that we've forgotten is that insulin, I told you, there are two problems in diabetes.
Yeah.
One is you don't make enough insulin. The other is you're insulin resistant. You need to attack both problems. And the paper that I recently published, which is a perspective in Lancet Diabetes Endocrinology, was to bring people back to, look, we're focusing on obesity and weight loss, and we should, but we need to remember that we still have a genetic cause for the insulin resistance. You know, you go back to 1950, the incidence of diabetes was 2%.
I've seen even data that says it was 1% as recent as 1970.
It's very low.
Yeah.
But these people were all lean and they're insulin resistant. So there's a genetic cause of the insulin resistance.
And you think, Ralph, that the greater genetic effect is on the insulin resistance side or on the beta cell fatigue side? In other words,
both.
Okay. So let's tackle each. And since you started with insulin resistance, let's go there.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what we know about the genetics of insulin resistance.
That's easy. Nothing.
Truly nothing.
No, I joke. But if you, let's say 20 years ago, we got involved in one of the biggest genetic studies called the VEGA study, Veterans Administration Genetic Epidemiologic Study. And we were convinced that we would do we were one of the people to do the first GWAS studies, that we would define all the genes that are responsible. Well, we were not very successful.
Even if you took the subset of people with type 2 diabetes who were lean,
Yep.
and you compared them to people who were lean and non-diabetic
Yep.
versus obese and diabetic, a GWAS was not able to identify a signal in those three cohorts?
We identified several, and remember, there are associations.
No, of course.
And they're in non-coding regions. So like the TCF7LT2 gene, that we found that, but that had already been described by Dr. Michael Stern in San Antonio many years before. So we repeated what Michael showed, and other people have shown that.
Wow.
So there are a number of associations, and again, if you ask me, how many genes have we truly established that are really important in terms of causing type 2 diabetes? I would say very, very few. I know the genetics people out there probably hate this, and they'll say that we can put together a genetic score. But, when they talk about a genetic score, it's not that they've causally associated a gene with diabetes.
It's an association.
It's an association. We have a whole different approach that will, if you want, I can tell you what we're doing that may give some insight. And then people have started to think about rare diseases, that maybe the problem is in one family you have this particular genetic mutation. Another family, you have a different genetic mutation. A third family, a different genetic mutation. And then when you do the GWAS study, you got this mixture of individual genes.
What about the phenotype, Ralph? So I've taken care of a couple of patients with type 2 diabetes who are very lean, including one patient whose body fat by DEXA was about 8%. So for people listening, that is insanely lean.
Very lean.
So you take an individual whose body fat is 8%, and yet they have type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
The first thing that comes to my mind is a lipodystrophy. Is this an individual whose adipose tissue is the problem? In other words, they're not able to assimilate enough excess nutrient, i.e. glucose, into the fat cell. And so they're undergoing the toxicity associated with an insufficient reservoir. Is that what could be the causal, not that I can tell you what's causing the lipodystrophy, but is the lipodystrophy the issue that's driving the diabetes here?
The answer to that is it's very clear that lipodystrophy can cause diabetes, okay? This is, I would say, a very, very rare and unusual cause, but well established.
But you're saying that's not what would explain 1% of diabetics.
No,
that's too,
no.
Okay.
And Jerry Schulman has done some beautiful work in this area. So it's unequivocal that lipodystrophic people, because their fat cells can't take up the fat, it ends up in your myocardium, cause heart disease. Ends up
in the
liver.
beta cells.
It ends in your beta cell in the muscle. But that's a very,
rare.
Very, very small percentage. So the basic genetic etiology of the insulin resistance, the PPAR gamma gene has been associated. There are about 7 or 8 genes. There's a recent study, I think it's in Nature Genetics by Brown, where they've identified 8, and again, they're associations, except I would say the PPAR gamma gene, that is pretty clear that's a causal.
Did Mitch Lazar do some of this work?
Pardon?
Mitch Lazar do some of this work at Penn?
He's worked in this area, but again, the number of, in my opinion...
It's a long list of folks at this point.
Well, yes. The number of genes that have been described. So one of the... And the other thing people have said, well, maybe there are 20 genes involved, each giving a small component, and that's why it's so difficult. Well, all of these hypotheses have been difficult to prove, and the simple fact is we don't understand the genetic basis, in part because diabetes, in my opinion, is a very poor phenotype. Diabetes is a very heterogeneous disease. So when we talk about diabetes, if that's your phenotype, it's not surprising to me that it's going to be difficult to define genes that are related to diabetes. So what I'm going to tell you about, I don't want to take the credit for this, okay? So one of the people in my division, Dr. Luke Norton, working with Steve Parker at Michigan, I'm involved because I'm doing the insulin clamp studies. We're taking as a phenotype muscle insulin resistance. This is a very, very specific phenotype, okay? This is not diabetes. The ominous octet, my pathophysiology, that's 8 problems, okay? This is muscle insulin resistance. I'm going to do an insulin clamp now, and then I'm going to do a muscle biopsy before I do the insulin clamp, and I'm going to do a muscle biopsy at the end of the insulin clamp. And what happens, okay? Well, during the insulin clamp, I know exactly how sensitive or resistant you are to insulin. I've got the most definitive phenotype in the world. No one gets this kind of phenotype. And now what do I see? An enormous amount of chromatin opens up. This is the epigenetic component. Genes in chromatin area that you're never ever going to see in the basal state. And that's why we think, this is a hypothesis now, that why it's been so difficult with all of these GWAS studies to identify genes that are associated with diabetes. And now we're starting to see in diabetic people and non-diabetic people, we're starting to see some associations which we think now are causal, and we can relate to the insulin resistance with the clamp. So the first paper along these lines.
Let's just pause there for a second, Ralph. I want to make sure everybody's following what you're saying. You're saying, look, one of the challenges of having a disease that isn't perfectly clearly defined, where every single member of the class that has the disease looks exactly the same, the word for that is heterogeneous.
Correct.
So let's take an example where the disease is very heterogeneous. Sickle cell anemia.
Correct.
Everybody who has sickle cell anemia, from a pathophysiology standpoint, is identical.
Correct.
And guess what? There's a single mutation that defines the disease. So because you have a single gene that defines the disease, one gene mutated produces one change in one base pair that changes one amino acid that changes the property of the hemoglobin molecule, and everybody looks the same. But you're saying, Peter, it's totally different. With type 2 diabetes, we have some people that are thin, some people that are fat, some people that have lots of insulin resistance in the muscle, some people that don't seem to have much, but it's all in the liver. We're going to go through, I want to make sure we define the octet, the ominous octet.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, why would you ever expect to find a simple genetic answer?
You
By
got it.
definition,
Perfect.
It's going to be a mess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have a very definitive phenotype, it's going to be difficult to define.
But the implication, by the way, is any physician who approaches a patient with type 2 diabetes as a single entity is going to be providing suboptimal care.
Yes. And, I've been fighting for 20 years to convince people you need to start with combination therapy from the beginning. Finally, 2022, the American Diabetes Association has made a comment, and for the first time, suggest that you should consider starting with combination therapy. We can talk about therapy later.
We're going to talk about the therapies in detail, but yes, you have to take a precision medicine approach to type 2 diabetes, which begins by trying to identify which phenotype your patient is.
Before we continue, I just want to make sure that everybody understands it's Luke Norton and Steve Parker, and they're the brain child. Of course, I'm involved. I understand the disease. We're doing the insulin clamps. We're giving them the phenotype, and they're doing single cell. And it turns out like there are 10, 12 different types of cells within the muscle. So we tend to think the muscle, there's a myocyte, that's the problem. But it's probably cells also talking to each other, making it even more complex. So we're at an early stage in the development, but we're enthusiastic. We think this is, we really have not discovered these genes. So we think that epigenetics are important, and this is part of the epigenetic phenomenon. We'll see where it takes us, but we're pretty excited about these findings.
Let's go back to the ominous octet, make sure I have that defined and all our listeners do.
Yeah. So in 2008 at the Banting lecture at the American Diabetes Association, the title of the Banting lecture was From the Triumvirate to the Ominous Octet. So what was the triumvirate? I got the Young Investigator Award, the Lilly Award from the ADA in 1987. So the triumvirate was very simple. The beta cell, it fails. Insulin resistance in the muscle. When you ingested a meal, the muscle didn't take up the glucose because you're insulin resistant. And insulin resistance in the liver. When you ate a meal, insulin didn't shut down the liver. So that was the triumvirate. So from the triumvirate to the ominous octet, we needed to add 5 more players. So who were the new 5 players? So number 4 on the list was the fat cell, and a very deserving guy. So the fat cell is your friend initially. You overeat, you take in excess calories, you store them in the fat cell that can't hurt you there. But if you keep expanding those fat cells, the fat cells become very, very resistant to the anti-lipolytic effects of insulin. And now you start to pour fat out into the bloodstream. We've shown this is a big interest in
very counterintuitive.
It's counterintuitive, but very, very well documented.
Not that we should mire ourselves in teleologic things. Yeah. Do you have a sense of why?
Yeah, so the insulin signaling system in multiple early steps become severely impaired. And when you get insulin resistance in the glucose metabolic pathway, there are changes that alter the cell metabolism, so you become very resistant to insulin's anti-lipolytic effect. And so now, if you look at people who are obese or people who have type 2 diabetes, their plasma FFA levels are very, very high. And those FFA levels, and this is lipotoxicity, and we've got a long history of studying this, high FFA levels impair insulin secretion. High FFA levels cause insulin resistance in the muscle. High FFA levels cause insulin resistance in the liver. High FFA levels impair the insulin signaling transduction system. And in fact, one of my previous fellows who's now back with me here in UT, Dr. Belfort, was the first author on this paper showing that just physiologic rises in the plasma FFA literally obliterate the insulin signal transduction system, which is the first step in glucose metabolism.
I always thought that the reason we saw high free fatty acids in people with type 2 diabetes was not because the fat cells were undergoing more lipolysis, but because the fat cells were themselves becoming resistant to insulin and not able to take up fat. So same net effect, but I was kind of drawing the arrow of causality in the other direction.
Yeah. No, the arrow is more on the other side. The fat is pouring out fat.
Right.
Yeah. And you can show that the lipolytic enzymes are all resistant to insulin. They don't, we've shown this, other people have shown it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So these elevated FFA levels are a disaster. So the fat cell initially is your friend.
He's your friend, he goes to foe.
Then it becomes a bad guy, okay? So that's number 4. Number 5 is the gastrointestinal tract. And of course, I'm sure talk more about this when we talk about treatment, but when you eat a meal, you release 2 incretin hormones, GLP-1 and GIP, glucagon-like peptide 1 and glucose-dependent insulin-trophic polypeptide. Those 2 incretin hormones, when you eat a meal, account for about 70% of the insulin that's released in response to the meal. So now, what is the problem? Is the problem that you don't release enough GLP-1 and GIP, or is it that your beta cell is refractory to the GLP-1 and GIP? Well, it's the later.
So let's say that again, Ralph. I want to make sure people understand this. And the reason it's important is, obviously, everybody listening to us right now is very familiar with drugs like semaglutide and tirzepatide.
Yep.
But I want people to understand why those drugs were developed. And of course, semaglutide's already probably the 3rd generation of it anyway. So when we go back in time, we'll understand why people try to develop these drugs. But just say that again. So you eat your meal.
Yep.
GIP, GLP-1 are increased.
And they come out normally.
Yep.
That's not the problem.
And they're telling the beta cell, hey, make more insulin.
Beta cell's deaf, not listening. Is resistant to the GLP-1 and GIP.
And he should be responding to 70% of his input should come from that signal.
70% of the insulin that's going to come out
is in response to that.
On that GLP-1 and GIP. So you can imagine that that's a huge problem at the level of the beta cell in terms of the defect in insulin secretion.
And tell me, why is it mechanistically that the beta cell becomes deaf to GLP-1 and GIP?
I don't know that we know the answer to that.
So it's just another horrible piece of this puzzle where everything starts to work against the patient.
Yes. So this is an area of course, intense investigation. But the clinical counterpart of this is you've already mentioned the drugs that are out there, the GLP-1 receptor agonist, what I'm doing is I'm giving you a pharmacologic dose of GLP-1, and I'm overcoming the resistance at the level of the beta cell. Now, there's another component to this that we'll get to, and that's glucotoxicity. So, and these were studies that were done by Jens Holtz and the group in Denmark, that they took people and they infused GIP. We're talking about GIP. Yes. And you don't respond to the GIP. These are type 2 diabetics. And then they intensively treated them with insulin and lowered their glucose. And then when they come back with the GIP, you reach a normal amount of insulin. So this is a glucotoxic effect. Okay, so you asked me mechanism, okay? So we know that at least for the GIP, the glucotoxicity is impairing the ability of the beta cell to respond to the GIP.
But not necessarily GLP-1.
No. And that doesn't correct the GLP-1 problem. So there's true resistance still, even though I normalize the glucose in terms of GLP-1. So this incretin axis, the gut, is a very important endocrine organ, and that's number 5 in the ominous octet. Number 6 in the ominous octet is the alpha cell, and sort of I would say the father of hyperglycemia. This is Dr. Roger Unger in Dallas, and he was one of the very first people to show that diabetics had very high glucagon levels. And glucagon
Tell people what glucagon does.
Yeah, glucagon it drives hepatic glucose production. So if your glucose gets too low, your alpha cells will release glucagon. So the alpha cell can sense the glucose. And so if you're hypoglycemic, this is an important defense mechanism. You release glucagon, that stimulates your liver, and the glucose production goes up. It returns your glucose to normal. But a diabetic already has a high glucose. We don't want high glucagon levels. So paradoxically, there's very high glucagon levels in the diabetic, and those high glucagon levels are a very important contributor to the hepatic insulin resistance because they're driving the liver to make glucose.
And sorry, just to make sure, because I'm embarrassed to say I forget this from biochemistry, is it driving the liver to make glucose out of, for example, glycerol, amino acids, or other things?
Gluconeogenic pathway and glycogenolysis.
Yep.
But on a more chronic, acutely, so if I acutely give you glucagon, the first thing that happens, you break down glycogen. But very quickly, you get rid of all the glycogen that's in the liver. And so chronically now you're running on gluconeogenesis. But glucagon stimulates both pathways.
And does it also drive hepatic glucose output, or
Yes.
does it just drive the creation of glucose?
No. In absolute terms.
It increases hepatic glucose output
Right.
as well as gluconeogenesis.
Yes. And that's a important reason why you have fasting hyperglycemia. So when you wake up in the morning.
Yeah, and your blood sugar is 110 milligrams per deciliter.
That's the liver. And part of that is because your liver is intrinsically resistant to insulin. Part of it is because the liver is now responding to the glucagon and producing an excess amount of glucose, both through gluconeogenesis and through glycogenolysis. Although I would say the major contributor is the gluconeogenic pathway. Now, that gluconeogenic pathway is also turned on because fat is coming from the fat cell. Remember, I told you the FFA is high.
Yes.
Cholesterol is coming from the fat cell.
Yes.
So, and Jerry, we talked about some of the work that Jerry did. This is Jerry's work, showing that glycerol coming from the fat cell is an important driver of gluconeogenesis. And then hepatic fatty acyl-CoA levels are up because you have all this fat pouring in, and that's activating the enzymes, pyruvate carboxylase, that are driving the gluconeogenic pathway. So the metabolic, the actual pathways, I think, are very well worked out. So glucagon, alpha cell, bad guy, okay?
And so is the alpha cell over-producing glucagon in this state?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is really Roger Unger in Dallas's
And again,
work.
Why is it over-producing it? Why is it doing something that doesn't make any sense in the context of what's happening?
In a certain way, this is also insulin resistance because hyperinsulinemia shuts down glucagon. And we have very high fasting insulin levels in the diabetic, okay? Now, what is it? What's the sensing mechanism within?
It's counterintuitive. Usually when things go wrong, they get attenuated,
Yeah.
right? Like it makes sense that the beta cell eventually fatigues because that's an attenuation of doing something that it's getting tired of doing. The alpha cell ramping up is a little less intuitive.
You're going to see it gets even worse when we talk about the kidney, which is number 7 on the list.
All right, let's go to number 7.
Okay, so people don't know I'm also board certified in nephrology. So in the old days, I trained as a micropuncturist. I used to sit with a microscope. I would draw my little pipettes out the night before, and then I would put the little micropipette in the tubules, and I collect tubular fluid. And what I was interested in, and this is when I was a renal fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, I was interested in glucose and phosphate transport. And I published a series of, I'd say they're pretty elegant papers in the JCI, looking at how glucose and what regulated glucose and phosphate transport. And I knew that there was a molecule called fluorescein that blocked glucose transport in the kidney. And so I took this molecule called fluorescein, and it blocks the glucose transporters. There are 2 transporters in the kidney, SGLT2 and SGLT1. SGLT2 takes back 90% of the glucose. If it does its job, SGLT1 takes back the other 10%. And then in you or I, even though we filter 180 grams of glucose per day, no glucose appears in the urine. But what I showed is that fluorescein, it blocked both SGLT2 and SGLT1. It blocked glucose transport, and it also blocked phosphate transport. And I showed that glucose and phosphate transport were coupled. But when I was doing these studies, even though I was a nephrology fellow, I had previous done my endocrine fellowship at the NIH in Baltimore City hospitals. So I had an interest in diabetes, and I said, this would be a great way to treat diabetes. So in the old days, we did things for science, and I published a series of 4 papers in the JCI, and I never even thought of, to be honest with you, of patenting this, okay? And I have a significant other who said to me one day, she said, Ralph, you're one of the smartest guys I ever met. And I said, yeah, I know that. And she said, you're probably the stupidest guy I ever met. And I said, why? She said, you could have patented this drug. And so I actually worked with Bristol Myers Squibb and then AstraZeneca, and that eventually led to the dapagliflozin coming to the market. But what we showed, and this is human biopsy.
Which is the first SGLT2 inhibitor.
That's correct. Yes.
Brand name on that one?
Forxiga.
Forxiga, right.
Yeah. And so
canagliflozin was next?
Empagliflozin, and then canagliflozin, ertugliflozin, we have a bunch of them. And they're all very good, basically do the same thing. But what we showed was the SGLT2 transporter was markedly upregulated in the kidney, okay? And the original studies that we did...
Hang on, let's just wrap our heads around that. This again, this is so counterintuitive.
I know.
Okay, this does not make any sense.
Right.
So you take it. I want to just bring it back to people listening so they understand what we're talking about here. The kidney is this massive filtration, another remarkable organ. No offense to the nephrologist, not as remarkable as the liver, but every bit as remarkable in terms of.
I think it's more remarkable than the liver guy, so that's okay.
All right. So everything that's floating through our plasma is, our kidneys, by the way, they take 25% of our cardiac output.
Huge.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's massive. This organ weighs 2% of our weight and takes 25% of our cardiac output. Why? Because we have to take everything that is in our circulation and dump it out.
Yep.
And then the kidney has to selectively bring back in what's normal. This was explained to me, I still remember in medical school, as kind of a brilliant trick of evolution. Evolution was never going to be able to predict every toxic thing we might encounter, and therefore teaching the kidney how to spot toxic things and get rid of them would have been a failed mission. Rather, it was better to teach the kidney what was absolutely necessary and to discard all other things. So,
pretty simple way.
Yep. So it's take everything out of your drawer and dump it out and only bring back the socks and underwear that you need.
Yep.
So glucose, potassium, sodium, you name it, chloride, phosphate, all of these things get dumped along with everything else.
Yeah.
And then it knows, I need this much glucose, I need this much sodium, I need this much potassium, da 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 da. So SGLT2 does the lion's share of this.
Yeah. It takes back 90% of the glucose. And now, so here's a diabetic with a very high glucose.
Right. So my point was SGLT2, if it had a brain, would say, oh, you have too much glucose.
Turn it off.
How about we just stop reabsorbing all this glucose?
That's why
you said it's the opposite.
I told you earlier it's going to get worse.
It ramps up SGLT2.
Yes. So as a doctor, I want the kidney to dump the glucose out in the urine.
Yeah.
But what is the kidney doing? It's doing the opposite. It's holding on to the glucose. And so even as a renal fellow, it became clear to me, this is such a simple way to treat diabetes. And the fact is, it's so simple, no one thought about it, okay? The only dumb thing that I did was I didn't patent it, which I should have done. I'd probably never have to write another NIH grant for the rest of my life. And then we went on to show, and in fact, this is the first definitive proof of the glucotoxicity hypothesis. So we did all of these studies initially in animals, and this was all published in the JCI. And Luciano Rossetti is one of the fellows at this time. Actually, Jerry Schulman was a fellow on the papers as well. And what we showed was that you could take different types of diabetic animal models, and you could show that they're reabsorbing excessive amounts of glucose. And then if I treated them with fluorescein, because that's what was available, they simply peed the glucose out in the urine. And now, all of a sudden, their beta cells started functioning normally. The muscle insulin sensitivity improved. So, of course, that's wonderful if you're a mouse or a rat. So we said, well, what about humans? And so the original studies actually were done, and there's kind of an interesting story behind this, but the initial studies were done with dapagliflozin. And we showed with just 14 days of treatment with dapagliflozin, we markedly lowered the fasting and postprandial glucose. We improved insulin sensitivity by 35%, and we made a major improvement in beta cell function. Now, the beauty of this, SGLT2 inhibitors are only in the kidney. They're not in your muscle. They're not in your beta cell. And the only thing that the SGLT2 inhibitors do makes you put glucose out in the urine. The only change in the plasma was the glucose came down. And now insulin sensitivity improved in muscle, and beta cell function improved. And this was the first, now in humans, even though the original studies were done in animals, first studies to show an improvement in the reality of glucotoxicity. What was interesting is that when we started to work on developing this with BMS and AstraZeneca, the company decided, well, we should get some nephrologists in to see about this story. And they said, look, if you listen to what Dr. DeFronzo says, this will be a disaster. And they said, why? Because if you put glucose in the urine, it will glycosylate the proteins, then you'll cause kidney damage. And they actually held up the development of the SGLT2 inhibitors. And the way we finally convinced them to go ahead was that there's a disease called familial renal glucosuria. They from day one of their life, they're bringing out tremendous amounts of glucose. They have perfectly normal kidney function.
How many grams of glucose can be differentially or extra secreted, basically, in the presence of an SGLT2 inhibitor today?
Upwards, it kind of depends on what the level of your GFR is, but it could be anywhere from 40 to 60 grams up to 120 grams of glucose. So there's
and the higher would be in somebody with a higher gradient?
Yeah, the higher the glucose.
The higher the,
Yes, because you filter more glucose, then there's more glucose to be blocked at the level of the kidney. And these drugs are very, very good. Now, I actually, in developing these drugs, as I said, I'm also a nephrologist. Based on the Berry-Brenner hypothesis, I predicted that these drugs would save your kidneys, according to the Brenner hypothesis. And that's all turned out to be correct. These drugs are great for the kidney. What I never, ever envisioned that these drugs were going to save your heart.
Yeah.
That was like, that came,
So I want to come back to that because I'm making notes of other things I want to come back to. And so I want to come back to just so you can hear me say it now and we remember. I want to come back to combined inhibitors, the SGLT2, SGLT1 inhibitor. I think there's a new drug that now...
Sotagliflozin.
Yeah, that it does both. We'll just touch on that. And then I want to also come back to the broader geroprotective nature of the SGLT2s as documented by the ITP in mice and then also in the human studies for cardioprotection. But before we do that,
we need to finish the
we got to go, exactly. Let's go back to number 8.
The brain. Okay. So the brain plays a role in a somewhat indirect way. So every day, you have your breakfast, your lunch. I actually eat only once a day, but at some point you eat a meal. And at some time during the meal, you'll say, okay, I'm hungry. I stop eating. Why'd you ever think? Why does that happen? Well, because there are certain hormones that are released or inhibited that tell you, okay, you're satiated, stop eating. Well, one of the very important ones is GLP-1. That same thing that's increasing insulin secretion. Your brain has become very resistant to GLP-1. When you eat a meal, amylin comes out. It comes out in a 1-to-1 ratio with insulin. Your brain has become resistant to amylin. Your brain is resistant to leptin. So there are a lot of these anorectic molecules that your brain has become resistant to. And these molecules, and it's another area of interest of mine, they work in the hedonic areas in the brain. So in the putamen, the prefrontal cortex, and they tell you to stop eating. And unfortunately, there's, and this is the big unknown, is what's going on in the brain. The neurocircuitry is clearly distorted. Not only is the neurocircuitry distorted, one of the big things that we are interested in, Dr. Peter Fox and myself at UT, is if you look at the gray matter in these areas, in the areas that are critically important in regulating your appetite, there's shrinkage of the gray matter area, okay? And in these areas, if you do an insulin clamp, okay, the brain is insensitive to insulin in your eye. In obese people, these areas in the brain where there's abnormal, marked increase in glucose uptake. Incredible finding. Who would have thought?
I'm sorry. You're saying that these are the few areas in my brain and your brain that are actually default insulin insensitive.
Yes.
Don't take up glucose.
Correct, if I do an insulin clamp.
So what is their fuel source? Lactate?
Well, they're saturated. I'm sorry. In response to insulin, they don't take up more glucose.
Okay. I'm sorry. Got it.
Because remember, this is from the Cahill studies. As long as your glucose is about 50, your brain is happy. So this is actually in the evolution of the human being. This is phenomenal because in the old days, you may not eat for, you may slaughter one of these beasts.
You're not eating for days.
You're not eating for days. So your glucose would drop. So if your normal fasting was 80, if it dropped to 40, you're okay because your brain saturated at 40. If you got below 40, you're in trouble. So you have a big sort of buffer here. But now if I infuse insulin and your glucose is 80, your brain doesn't take up more glucose. It's, quote, insulin insensitive in a certain way.
Now, of course, if you take people with mild cognitive impairment, there's been some experiments that actually suggest in these people, insulin infusion can transiently improve glucose uptake, but presumably that's because they're insufficiently getting glucose in the disease state?
Yes. This has been postulated.
Yeah.
And there's also suggested that there's brain insulin resistance.
Yeah.
Which is, I'd say, an interesting concept and may play some role in this neurocognitive dysfunction, Alzheimer's, whole kind of different story that's sort of in evolution. But to come back to the ominous octet now, if you overeat, what happens? You gain weight. And when you gain weight, you become insulin resistant, severely insulin resistant. That's lipotoxicity, okay? And we've done studies in both directions. I can put an IV and I can infuse an emulsion of free fatty acids. And I can show within 4 hours, 2 to 4 hours, I induced severe insulin resistance in the muscle, in the liver, and I markedly impaired beta cell function. And then we don't have this drug in the United States, but there's a drug that's available in Europe, and I have an IND to use it. It's called Acipamax. It inhibits lipolysis. It's like SGLT2 inhibitor. The only thing to do is block glucose reabsorption in the kidney. Sipamox, all it does is block lipolysis. It lowers your FFA level. And we've done this.
Does it result in any meaningful clinical increase in adiposity, or is it so subtle that you don't notice it?
Over 12 days, no change in adiposity, huge improvement in insulin sensitivity and muscle. You can show all of these major biochemical.
Why is it not approved in the U.S.?
It was. I don't know that the company that developed it in Europe ever tried to get it approved in the U.S. It's, I would say, modestly effective in lowering triglycerides. And we have phenofibrates, which are much more effective. So that may be the reason, although this drug been around for...
But the triglyceride and the FFA are not the same thing.
No. But that's the reason why it's approved in Europe. But if you lower the FFA, that's the precursor for triglyceride synthesis. So it has an effect to lower the triglycerides. But the key thing is if you lower the FFA, and we did this for 12 days, we did it in both obese people and in diabetic, you markedly improve insulin sensitivity in the muscle. If using MRI, you can measure muscle fat. It goes down dramatically and correlates with the improvement in insulin sensitivity. We also measured ATP generation because there's this issue is there's clearly mitochondrial dysfunction if you're a diabetic. That's unequivocal. The controversy is the mitochondrial dysfunction causing the insulin resistance, or is the insulin resistance causing the mitochondrial dysfunction? So in this study that we did, when we lowered the FFA and lowered the muscle lipid content, we saw about a 50% improvement in ATP generation, mitochondrial ATP generation. So at least this says that part of the mitochondrial dysfunction is secondary to the lipotoxicity and insulin resistance. But this still remains, I would say, a controversial topic. Clearly, there's mitochondrial dysfunction. If you can improve it, that's going to improve insulin sensitivity.
Is there anything that improves mitochondrial function more than aerobic exercise training?
Pioglitazone. The drug
how so?
I can't get people to use, which is a phenomenal. By activating PPAR gamma, it does a lot of good things, and one of the important things that it does, it has a huge effect to improve mitochondrial dysfunction, and it has direct effects. It also works it works directly through PPAR gamma to do this, and it also binds directly to the mitochondrial pyruvate carrier, and that influences flux through the mitochondrial chain.
And why don't people use this drug today?
Huge misconceptions. So I guess we'll talk about therapy.
We'll come back to it. Okay, we'll park it till we come back to that.
As part of my triple therapy regimen, I use a GLP-1 receptor agonist. I use Pioglitazone, and I use an SGLT2 inhibitor. Now, there's a fourth good drug, and that's Metformin. And you might ask, well, why is Metformin number 4 on my list of good drugs, since I single-handedly brought Metformin to the United States in 1995. No other endocrinologist involved in this. 1995, Metformin was a revolutionary drug. Why? We had insulin and sulfonylureas, okay? So now we had a drug that really could work, okay? And it's still a very good drug. And of course, it's very cheap. It's $5 a month in the state of Texas. But we have much better drugs. Pioglitazone causes weight gain, okay? Now, here's the problem, and it'll become very obvious. You know, we talk about these paradoxes. The more weight gain, the greater the drop in A1C. The more weight gain, the greater the improvement in insulin sensitivity.
And is it fat gain specifically?
No. Oh, I'll come back to that in a second, okay? It is fat weight gain, and I also believe muscle weight gain, okay? The more weight gain, the greater the improvement in beta cell function. The more weight gain, the greater the drop in blood pressure. The more weight you gain, the greater the drop in triglycerides. The more weight you gain, the greater the rise in HDL cholesterol. Sounds like a terrible drug, right? So here's another one of those paradoxes, okay? So why would weight gain? We know if you overeat and gain weight, that's a disaster. But with Pioglitazone, the more weight you gain, everything gets better. What Pioglitazone does is it shifts weight around in the body. In my opinion, it's the best drug for treating NASH. No drug is going to beat Pioglitazone, okay? And the pharmaceutical companies, they don't. If you had to go up against Pioglitazone, all these NASH drugs, I don't believe you can beat Pioglitazone.
What's the brand name for Pioglitazone?
Actos.
Oh,
okay.
Right, yeah.
The as I said, there's this now paradox. So why do you gain weight? Pioglitazone, it redistributes fat in the body. It gets it out of the muscle, puts it in subcutaneous tissue. Gets it out of the liver, puts it in subcutaneous tissue. Gets it out of your beta cells, put it in subcutaneous tissue. That's not going to make you gain weight. The richest density of PPAR gamma receptors in the hypothalamus. So when I activate these PPAR gamma receptors in the hypothalamus, you eat. Okay? It makes you hungry. That's got nothing to do with redistributing the fat in the body, except they parallel each other in association. And so you see the weight gain, and people say, oh, that's bad. But what's really doing the thing is this recycling, okay, and moving the fat around. The other negative thing about Pioglitazone is it causes fluid retention, okay? So people have associated fluid retention with heart failure. Now, why do you get fluid retention? Again, this is people do not understand. Pioglitazone, the only drug that is a true insulin sensitizer is Pioglitazone. Metformin is not a true insulin sensitizer. That's total misconception. Pioglitazone, that insulin signaling defect that I told you about, Pioglitazone corrects that defect. It's incredible.
So we kind of glossed over this, Ralph, because we were going to spare people the details, but it's probably worth just reminding people.
Yeah.
Insulin binds to the insulin receptor.
Yeah.
That's outside the cell.
Yeah.
Is that that's a kinase receptor, correct?
Yeah. There are 3 tyrosine molecules.
Yep.
And they have to be phosphorylated.
Yep.
And and these are studies done, Ron Kahn and other people in Boston, you mutate one of those tyrosines, you become a little insulin resistant. You mutate 2 of them, you become moderately insulin resistant. You mutate 3 of them, you're severely insulin resistant. Insulin binds to the receptor.
Yep.
Okay, that happens normally in diabetics. We showed that there's no problem there. Then IRS1, insulin receptor substrate 1, moves in.
Which is inside the cell, comes up.
Yes.
Yep.
And it interacts with the insulin receptor, and it gets phosphorylated on the same 3 tyrosine molecules. And then you activate PI3 kinase, AKT, AS110. We could add some more molecules in here, but this is the insulin signaling pathway. That's the pathway that the earliest defect that you can show in diabetics is in that pathway, okay?
And if I recall, isn't this where Jerry argued that the intramyocellular lipid was creating the defect in that pathway?
Yes.
The accumulation of intramyocellular lipid?
So what Jerry has shown very elegantly, okay, is that there are certain lipids. DGAT is
that's right.
And it's a specific DGAT. There are like several types of DGAT molecules, which has confused things. So he's shown there's a specific one of the DGATs that activates these atypical PKC molecules, and that serine phosphorylates the insulin receptor. When you serine phosphorylate the molecules in that pathway, it inactivates them, okay? And so he's done these very nice, elegant studies, both in peripheral muscle and in the liver, showing that this plays a very, very important role in the insulin resistance. This is part of the lipotoxicity. I don't believe that this is the genetic basis, the genetic etiology. Mm-hmm. This is when you get fat and you start putting fat everywhere. This is very important, critically important. And that was when he gave his Banting lecture. And I might say I'm delighted that I got to write his letter of nomination for the Banting lecture. He was incredibly deserving. He's done phenomenal work in this area. But that was his Banting lecture. And you're right. Yep. Very, very, very important mechanism of insulin resistance.
And so given that that's both a very important and very common pathway towards insulin resistance, bringing it back to PPAR gamma is part of the pathway It's part of the IRS1, PPAR gamma, PI3K,
Yes.
GLUT4, bring the glucose in the cell. In other words, if people don't want to get mired down in this, which is totally understandable, insulin hits a receptor. That receptor kicks off a cascade that ultimately results in a little tube being like a little straw that goes into the cell surface that allows glucose to freely flow in against its in its gradient.
But remember, that same pathway also activates nitric oxide synthase.
That's right.
Generates nitric oxide.
And that's why we see in patients with insulin resistance, even if glucose is controlled, cardiovascular disease is still up.
A very important
very important point. So back to Actos.
Yeah. So
it is.
So now, what does it do? It activates that signaling pathway. You generate nitric oxide. Now you vasodilate. That's why the blood pressure drops. When you vasodilate, so I'm a nephrologist, I understand this very clearly. Anytime you underperfuse the kidney, you hold on to salt and water. You become edematous, okay? So people associate fluid retention and edema with heart failure. So we did the definitive study. It's published in Diabetes Care in 2017. People just don't read, okay? So we took people who had diabetes, and we treated them with Pioglitazone. And then using NMR, very, very sophisticated techniques, what we showed is Pioglitazone markedly improved myocardial blood flow. Now, these numbers are going to blow your mind away. Myocardial insulin sensitivity with PET and fluorodeoxyglucose improved by 75%. Your heart, we showed this before, is severely insulin resistant. I came pretty damn close to normalizing insulin sensitivity in your heart. Now, since we're doing the insulin clamp with treated glucose,
you can track it.
74% improvement in skeletal muscle insulin sensitivity.
It's the same.
Exactly the same. If you look at ejection fraction, it went up by 5 to 10%, not down. It went up. If you look at every measure of diastolic dysfunction, E over A, E over E prime, LV, peak filling pressures, etc. Cardiology people understand this. The point is, whether you're looking at systolic function or diastolic function, it all got better.
So it's a victim of maybe not so nuanced thinking about the drug.
Yeah.
Now the critic would push back and say, "Okay, Ralph, but don't we have better drugs?" Like, I mean,
no drug that corrects insulin resistance. Right. Metformin is not an insulin sensitizer, and people keep going back to this. So I brought Metformin to the U.S. in 1995. I know this. I did all the mechanism of action studies, and what we showed was the insulin clamp. The drug absolutely does not improve insulin sensitivity.
So let's talk about Metformin. Everybody wants to know if Metformin is geroprotective, but let's just remind people, So Metformin inhibits complex 1 of the mitochondria. Is that of the electron transport chain? Is that a given?
Yes. I'd say this is still controversial. Okay. In high doses, for sure, yes. And the kind of doses you see with giving Metformin, I would say somewhat equivocal, in my opinion.
So is the belief that Metformin's efficacy in diabetes is through reducing hepatic glucose output?
That is 100% true.
Okay, and what's the mechanism by which it reduces hepatic glucose output?
Inhibiting the mitochondrial chain and inhibiting gluconeogenesis. Well, for sure it inhibits gluconeogenesis, okay? Now, Metformin gets into cells through the organic cation transporter. The organic cation transporter doesn't exist in muscle. It can't possibly be an insulin sensitizer in muscle. You're asking the drug to do something that's impossible. And if you give labeled Metformin.
Does it get into muscle mitochondria?
No, it doesn't get into muscle at all.
Why does lactate go up when people are taking Metformin?
Level of the liver. It's interfering with aerobic metabolism. And so there's a block. And
This is very important. I have erroneously always believed that. So I'm really happy to be corrected. I love being proved wrong. I have always believed that the reason we saw an increase in fasting lactate, even in healthy people, if they took Metformin, was because of the inhibition of the ECT in skeletal muscle.
No.
And you're saying, Peter,
it's all in
that's
the
not
liver.
possible. It can't get into skeletal muscle?
As absolutely not a single molecule in the world of metformin has ever gotten into any skeletal muscle anywhere.
And tell me again why. What's the transporter?
The organic cation transporter. That's the transporter that by which metformin enters cells. It does not exist in skeletal muscle. It does not exist in cardiac muscle. So metformin cannot get into these tissues. It's a huge, major misconception. It can, if you have very, very high doses, that can occur when you have very low GFR, because metformin is excreted via the kidney. If the metformin levels build up, you can get lactic acidosis. That's a very, very rare complication. There's not a reason why you shouldn't be using the metformin. And I'm not saying that metformin is not a good drug. It is a good drug. I don't think it's as good as the other 3 drugs we talked about. But yes, it does, at high doses, increase the lactate level, all in effect on the liver. And the old drug that caused all the problem was fenformin, a biguanide as well, but it had a powerful effect.
Yeah, fenformin was much more powerful.
Yes, and that's why people were afraid to bring metformin to the U.S.
And when you say high dose, I mean, is 2 grams a day of metformin?
No.
That's the normal dose?
That's the normal dose.
Okay, so metformin has the following going for it. It's free.
Very cheap. Yes, it's basically free.
Yeah, it's free.
Absolutely.
And it does a pretty good job at reducing hepatic glucose output.
Yeah.
And it has no myotoxicity.
Correct.
Or, frankly, any toxicity.
GI.
Yeah, the GI, but you can usually overcome that with a slow ramp up.
Yeah. And see, this is the reason why some people thought it's an insulin sensitizer. 15 to 20% of people have significant GI side effects and they lose weight. And if you look at the studies, on average, there's about a 3 kilogram weight loss with metformin. And when you lose weight, you can improve insulin sensitivity. So I think this is what's confused some of the old literature to make people think that metformin was an insulin sensitizer. But when we developed metformin, and I did all of the work that went to the FDA. If you look at the New England Journal of Medicine article 1995, there are only 2 names on the paper, myself and a PhD oncology lady who was the person from Lifa Pharmaceuticals. We did insulin clamps, many of them. We never could show metformin improved insulin sensitivity using the gold standard with radioisotopes.
Do you think many people, I feel like I'm asking you this question a lot and it's getting a little old, but do you get the sense that most people are still thinking what I think, which
Yes.
is that metformin gets into the muscle?
Yes.
Metformin's an insulin sensitizer.
Absolutely.
And it's an insulin sensitizer by getting into the muscle and inhibiting complex 1.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
People have done PET studies. So you can label metformin and you give it, okay? And then where do you see? It's all accumulating in the liver, okay? In the first 3, 4, 5, 10 minutes. And then what happens? You start to see it accumulating in the kidney, okay? Why? Because that's where it's excreted. And then wait another 5 or 10 minutes, you see it in the bladder, okay? And that's the only place where you see metformin. You never see it in the muscle, okay? And that's even more graphic demonstration, that metformin is not getting in the muscle, and it is definitely not an insulin sensitizer.
Is there a downside to using metformin in combination with the other 3 drugs of which we've...
No. The classic study, which we'll talk about, which to me should change the entire approach to treating diabetes, it's called the EDIC study. And in the EDIC study, what we did is we used triple therapy right from the beginning. And my point of the Banting lecture, the ominous octet, if you have 8 problems, and I'm sure going to be more to be found, and I can give you a few more if you want. But if you have 8 problems, why in the world do you think one drug is going to correct 8 problems? It ain't going to happen in our lifetime. So the point was you need to use drugs in combination. So we said we're going to use what we think are the best drugs at the time. So we started with metformin, with exenatide, an old-time GLP-1. This is not the kingpin.
This is the pre-liraglutide.
Yeah, exactly, because that's what was available.
That drug was useless, wasn't it?
No, it's a good drug.
Really?
Sure, it's not semaglutide or
Yeah,
tirzepatide,
okay.
but you have to start somewhere, right?
Let's pay it its dues as being the Gen 1 OG version of that drug, without
Exactly.
which we might not have...
We wouldn't
have semaglutide or tirzepatide.
Yes.
Yep.
So it's kind of an old timer.
Yep.
And Pioglitazone, that was the triple therapy, okay? And then we said, every diabetic patient, there are 315 people in this study. They're having insulin clamps, hyperglycemic clamps, muscle biopsy. No one in the world can do this study. 315 people, followed for 6 years, okay? So we said, this is what we believe is the appropriate therapy. And then we said, we'll use the ADA approach. The ADA approach is you start on metformin, okay? And when you fail, even though it explicitly said the next drug that's used is sulfonylureas, and then the third drug that's added is insulin. And we said that the goal of therapy was an A1C of 6.5, okay? And that if your A1C rose above 6.5, either on our triple therapy or on the stepwise treat to fail approach that the ADA says. ADA says start metformin, you fail, you add sulfonylurea, you fail, you add insulin. You titrate the insulin, basal insulin up to 60 units. And we said 60 units is really where we'll cap it because...
Yeah, you're already at 2x physiologic.
Yeah, and now you have to split the dose of insulin. You have to be adding rapid-acting insulin. I think this is quite reasonable. 6 years later, okay, 29% of the people with the ADA approach have failed. Their A1C is above 6.5. 6 years later, with our approach, 70% of the people have an A1C that's less than 6.5. Why? Insulin clamp. Huge improvement with our therapy. Okay, this is the eating study. The 3-year data are published, the 6-year data, we're writing it up. How much improvement in insulin sensitivity with the ADA approach? 0. Beta cell function. You have almost a normal beta cell.
Ralph, why the disconnect?
Between where?
Between what you're seeing in the eating study and what the ADA is promoting.
You have to ask the ADA.
What's their answer? If I'm a patient or if I'm a physician who's treating these patients and I'm saying, guys, I'm confused. I'm looking at the literature. I'm seeing this. I'm looking at your, and by the way, I see this with the AHA and cardiovascular guidance. So I'm not singling out you but like, is this simply a question of the pace at which medicine moves is so glacial?
That's part of it. Plus, remember, if to do 315 people, follow them for 16 years, and do all the stuff we did, it's unequivocal.
And why has there not been political pressure? Because the cost of insulin is enormous, and your approach is going to be less expensive.
They finally said in 2022, there's a statement. The ADA approach is not based on pathophysiology. I view myself as a scientist, okay, as well as a clinician. As a good clinician, I've taken care of hundreds of thousands of patients, and I've done 850 publications. I do clinical research. I work in people. When I do an insulin clamp study and I see an improvement in insulin sensitivity, I do a hyperglycemic clamp and I see in 315 people your beta cell function. I don't need 5,000 people. I can't do this study in 5,000 people. No one can do this study. But the tools that we're using are so powerful. Look, if I normalize your insulin sensitivity and I give you a normal beta cell and your A1C is less than 6.5 and it's half of the 315 people, why do you not think that's the best therapy? Okay? And now on the other side, I have this metformin SU insulin, and that 71% of the people have failed. There's 0 improvement in insulin sensitivity, 0 improvement in beta cell function. Why do you think that's such a good regimen? And now, above and beyond all that, I didn't do this study. This is the GRADE study, GRADE. It's sponsored by the National Institutes of Health. And what the GRADE study said is, and I have to say, this is the third study that's shown what I'm going to tell you. Dr. Robert Turner's United Kingdom prospective diabetes study showed this in year 1990. Stephen Karn showed this in the ADOPT study in year 2005, and now we have the GRADE study, 2020. I call this the 15-year revelation. We saw what didn't work 1990. Oh, Stephen Karn did it again. Oh, it didn't work in 2005, and now 2020, NIH did it. You know what? All show the same thing.
And this was a sequential approach.
You had to have failed on metformin to get into the study.
Okay, so you failed in metformin, then you enter the study, then we go single agent.
They want to know what's the best next drug to add to metformin. I can add a sulfonylurea. A1C went down in year 1, up straight. I can add...
Tell folks how a sulfonylurea works.
Sulfonylureas are old-time drugs. They bind to the sulfonylurea receptor on the beta cell and they kick out insulin.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very good drugs in the first year.
And then they burn out the pancreas.
Well, they stop working.
Yeah. I mean, basically, they kick the can down the road without addressing the pathophysiology.
I like that way.
Yes.
Then other drug, DPP-4 inhibitor.
Tell people how those work.
So a DPP-4 inhibitor increases your GLP-1 and your GIP level endogenously. It makes your gastrointestinal cells, the K and the L cells that secrete the GLP-1 and GIP, makes them make more GLP-1 and GIP. But it doesn't increase the GLP-1 and GIP enough to really give you a knockout punch. I give you an injection. People are out there, Mounjaro or semaglutide, that's the knockout punch, okay? When I give you the DPP-4 inhibitors, they do increase GLP-1 and GIP a little bit, but not powerful enough to give you a long-lasting effect. So first year, A1C comes down, A1C goes up. Third drug, this was very surprising to me. This was liraglutide. This is one of the earlier GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Gen 2.
Yeah, I thought that was going to work the best. It failed. It worked in the first year and then failed. And then the fourth drug was insulin. And the docs just didn't titrate the insulin enough, so A1C down, and then they failed. So 5 years later, all 4 of those regimens added to metformin failed. Triple therapy, exenatide, an old-time GLP-1, Pioglitazone, which people don't appreciate, the only true insulin sensitizer, and metformin. 6 years later, you're 70% of the people have an A1C less than 7.
And let's just go back. Metformin is free. The Gen 1
exenatide basically free.
Is basically free now.
Pioglitazone is $5 a month.
Okay, so we have 3 free drugs that work better.
Correct.
Now, it's interesting, when you talk about today's triple therapy, which is way more efficacious,
different story.
2 of those 3 drugs are very expensive.
Yes.
The SGLT2 inhibitors are very expensive, and the modern day Gen 3, Gen 4, and soon we'll have a Gen 5 GLP-1, they're very pricey.
They're very $1,000 a month for the, yeah. Now, are they great drugs?
So the question is,
of course,
but I guess the question is, do you need to be on those drugs if your old version of triple therapy?
Our old version is incredibly effective. The problem is you can't get people to use Pioglitazone.
And the reason is the patients are frustrated with the fact that they're retaining water?
No, more that they gain weight.
How much weight do they gain typically? How many kilos?
Depends on the dose. I don't go to the 45 milligram dose. So at the end of the year, they may gain 2 or 2.5 kilos at the 15 and 30 milligram dose, okay? But their A1C is controlled. So you have to explain to people. Here's another incredible thing. So there was a cardiovascular, this is truly incredible.
By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
If you give PO plus a modern day GLP-1, don't you offset the weight gain?
You cannot believe, you lose all the weight you lose with the GLP-1 receptor agonist.
So if a patient is willing to go down the path of a modern day GLP-1, doesn't that completely eliminate?
Absolutely. And it also gets rid of the edema.
Yeah.
And believe me, their A1Cs are down in the normal range. You know, if you took my hands, so let me tell you this first thing about Pioglitazone and the proactive. I'll come back and we'll answer this. So in the proactive study, this was done a long time ago. You have to show cardiovascular safety. 5,238 people. To get into the study, you had to have an MI, stroke, or something bad. Half people on Pioglitazone, half the people on placebo, okay? And the MACE endpoint, major adverse cardiovascular events, which is non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, cardiovascular mortality, you have to show the benefit to get approval by the FDA. The MACE endpoint was positive, okay? And so when I talk to cardiologists, I like to say, what was the one thing in the Pioglitazone that predicted that you would not die? They don't know. You know what the one thing that predicted that you wouldn't die? Weight gain. So I jokingly say, look, you can either be a little fat and alive, or you can be lean and dead. Which one you going to pick? I think I go for being a little bit chubby. So again,
but now that's not even a necessary comparison. You don't even need to make that trade-off with a modern day GLP-1 agonist.
And we've done this, and we've published this. If you tied my hands behind my back and said, Ralph, you can only pick one drug, I would pick one of the newer GLP-1s. They're incredible drugs. Now, but that's not what I'm going to do.
Even for a lean diabetic?
They're a little bit different story, but the answer is basically yes. Okay, but let me narrow that down a little bit. If I had to pick two drugs, I would pick Pioglitazone with one of the newer drugs, and for sure, if you had any kind of renal or cardiac disease, I'm going to pick an SGLT2 inhibitor. But I would say, although this study will never be done, if you're a newly diagnosed diabetic and you don't have any cardiac symptoms, why do you think that the SGLT2 inhibitor is not doing all of the beneficial things in that newly diagnosed diabetic that it's doing in the people who get into these studies who already have cardiac disease? So if you have a cardiac problem, I put you on the SGLT2 inhibitor, you're less likely to have MI, stroke, etc. It's doing good things. It's doing, in my opinion, the exact same good thing in someone who I'm just diagnosing for the first time when I put them on the SGLT2 inhibitor, but no one is ever going to do a study. It's impossible. I'm going to take 1,000 people, and you have to take you probably have to take 20,000 people, newly diagnosed, and then 10,000 go on SGLT2 and 10,000 on placebo. I'm going to follow them for 20 years to see who's going to have their heart attack. No one's going to do that study because they're going to get on all kinds of drugs. So no one is going to be able to show.
But that's sort of like, yeah, that's never going to happen. But I also don't think it needs to happen in the same way that
I agree with you.
In the same way that we saw, for example, PCSK9 inhibitors reduced MACE in people with secondary prevention. So take people who had already suffered MACE, put them on a PCSK9 inhibitor, secondary prevention, reduce subsequent. Well, of course, everybody's using these for primary prevention now. That's effectively what you're saying.
Sure.
Is we already know the SGLT2 works for secondary prevention. That may never get approval for primary prevention, but it probably justifies its use.
Perfect way of putting it. Yeah. I agree with you 100%.
So just to make sure I'm synthesizing what you're saying, Ralph, if you only get one drug and you're price agnostic, GLP-1 agonist.
Yeah.
If you get to add a second drug, you're going to add PO.
Yeah.
If you get a third drug, especially if you care about your heart,
in
SGLT2.
Kidneys. Yeah. SGLT2.
And what's amazing is Metformin didn't even make the top 3 in your list.
But it's number 4.
But so here's my question. Given that Metformin is free, should we just be adding it the second we put on the GLP-1?
I don't have any problem with that. Yeah. And also we have to be cognizant of the fact, these newer GLP-1s, we're talking
so
about,
potent.
Yeah, but they're $1,000 a month.
Yeah.
So,
I want to ask you about that. So just again for the listeners, right? The semaglutide's Gen 3, tirzepatide is Gen 4, retatrutide is coming out, assuming the phase 3 goes according to plan.
Yeah. And CardiSema is the new Nova one.
Yeah. So here, let's go back to retatrutide.
Yeah.
GLP-1.
Yeah.
GIP.
And glucagon.
Glucagon. Can you explain that in the context of the octet where glucagon is going up?
I can, I think.
Okay.
But it's not proven.
All right.
Okay. Remember I told you that insulin knocks down glucagon. So if I give you a GLP-1 receptor agonist and I kick out insulin and I get you well insulinized, any negative effect that might be related to glucagon is going to be obviated, okay? So that glucagon effect to drive hepatic glucose production will be totally blunted by the insulin secretory effect. And see, this is the other thing that bothers me about these GLP-1s. These are the best drugs in the world for losing weight. These are the best drugs in the world for saving your beta cell. People, I told you that when you eat a meal, 70% of the insulin that's secreted is coming from the GLP-1 and the GIP. People have stopped talking about this effect on the beta cell. I told you, if you want to look at type 2 diabetes, big problems, beta cell failure, insulin resistance. These GLP-1s, they're saving your beta cell. I mean, we've forgotten about it. We've become so enamored with the weight loss. And I don't want to downplay that at all, because the weight loss and the lipotoxicity, a huge problem that's causing the insulin resistance. But people have forgotten how powerful the drugs are on the beta cell. So when I give you this drug and they work on the beta cell and kick out insulin, any negative thing that glucagon's doing will be totally negated. Now, you may see some good things that glucagon are doing that we couldn't appreciate before. So what are the good things? Some people have suggested that increases thermogenesis, energy expenditure. I don't believe that. There are animal data.
Yeah,
I don't believe this in humans.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I believe that it's exerting an anorectic effect in the central nervous system. That is, I think, yet to be established. I'm pretty sure there are studies going on now at the Pennington Institute and maybe also in Orlando, where they have these chambers where you can...
TRI.
Yeah. So I think we'll get an answer about, energy expenditure. I
would be surprised if they're going to see a clinically meaningful increase in involuntary energy expenditure.
I'm with you.
Yeah, I think it's central.
I think it's all appetite.
Yeah.
And here's another issue, okay? So it is very interesting. If you look at all these big GLP-1 studies, cardiovascular, what's the reduction in cardiovascular events? Almost uniformly 20%. Old dudes, exenatide, et cetera, liraglutide, new dudes, 20%. Even though the weight loss with the newer ones
is much greater.
Much greater. I suspect in terms of cardiovascular benefit, there is a cap. That once you've lost a certain amount of weight and you've gotten a certain amount of lipotoxicity and all the good things that these drugs are doing, you don't go beyond that, even though you're losing more weight. And also, if you look at the A1C, yes, Mounjaro does drop the A1C a little bit more than semaglutide, but they're both pretty powerful. Rituximab does a little bit more, and does CagriSema do a little bit more, but they don't do a lot more. So I also think there's also going to be a somewhat of a cap on how much you drop the A1C. You get 2.5% drop. Can you drop it 3? Do you need to drop it 3?
So you're saying if a person shows up with a hemoglobin A1C of 9.5%.
Yep.
This is a person who hasn't come to medical attention soon enough.
And I'm going to give you the answer definitively, but I'm going to let you ask the question.
You're happy if they only go from 9.5% to 7%? If they only had a 2.5% drop, you wouldn't try to get them down to 6%?
I would, and we've done the study. Okay? Old-time guys, all right? So this is called the Qatar study. So there's this concept that's out there. And again, people don't, what's always amazing to me, what drives me is science. If you understand pathophysiology and there's an abnormality and you correct the abnormality, things get better, okay? So in the Qatar study, and there are 220 people or so in the study. To get into the Qatar study, you had to be poorly controlled on metformin and sulfonylurea. So you had to have failed on this. And the average A1C was about 10. And about a third of these people were symptomatic, meaning they had polyuria, polydipsia, they were losing weight. And so the current concept is, in those people, you would put them on a mixed split insulin regimen. You would get rid of the glucotoxicity, you would get rid of the lipotoxicity, and you get their A1C down to 6.5. And then now you could put them back on the oral medications or whatever. And now they respond because you got rid of the glucotoxicity and lipotoxicity. We said, well, that may or may not be true. So we said, well, half of these people are starting with an A1C above 10. Will go on a mixed split insulin regimen, okay, with glargine and a rapid-acting insulin. And the other half are going to go on that old dude exenatide and Pioglitazone, the one that people don't like to use, okay? 3 years later, the A1C in the group with the mixed split insulin regimen is 7.1%. And we're very good at insulin. Why couldn't we go lower? Because we got into trouble with hypoglycemia. Okay, the A1C in the group treated with exenatide and Pioglitazone is 6.1, and so then we said, okay, look, we'll do a subgroup analysis, and so about 1/3 of the people were, we'll just look at the people who are symptomatic. The starting A1C is 12.2. 3 years later, their A1C is 6.1.
How long?
6.1. 3 years later.
From 12?
Yeah. 12.2 symptomatic.
On which combination?
Exenatide and pioglitazone.
Without even metformin?
Without, they had failed on metformin and SU to get into the study. Okay? So what we're saying, look, if you have drugs that correct the insulin resistance, that's pioglitazone.
Again, Ralph, this is almost impossible for me to imagine.
I can send you all the papers. It's all published.
But I hope every single family medicine internist, everyone who ever takes care of somebody with diabetes is listening.
I hope so too.
Because you're basically saying we can take these two old, cheap drugs and take someone from the most brittle type 2 diabetes. I mean, a hemoglobin A1C of 12,
pretty bad.
You're knocking on death's door.
Correct.
You're going to go blind.
Yep.
You're going to have your toes amputated. You're not ever going to have an erection again. And you're going to die of cardiovascular disease or kidney disease or Alzheimer's disease quickly.
These numbers that I'm telling you, they're right from the paper, and it's over 200 people.
And in a couple of years, on two old, cheap drugs,
Yep.
You're normal.
Yep. And what's better, what makes these studies so solid is we have very sophisticated pathophysiologic measurements. No one can do what we do.
So the only pushback is those patients are going to have to gain a couple of kilograms of, but of course, if you're willing to now spend a bit more money and switch them from Gen 1 to Gen 3 or Gen 4 GLP-1 agonist and GIP, then all of a sudden you ameliorate that and you get all the benefits.
This becomes a non-issue. If put cost aside.
In fact, I would wonder if you add metformin, you almost cancel out the weight gain a little bit because you might get a little bit of the GI improvement and you get the 2 to 3 kilos of weight loss there minus.
These drugs are so powerful when you put them with pioglitazone, you don't get you lose almost the same amount of weight. They're huge in terms of getting you to lose weight. I mean,
so which was that study?
This is called the Qatar. It was done in Qatar. Q-A-T.
Oh, like Qatar, the country.
The country.
Yeah.
So, and I need to give credit to Dr. Mohammed Abdul-Ghani, who's been sort of, my co-worker in all of these studies. And Mohammed's on the faculty at UT in our diabetes division.
Can we at least assume that the Gulf states are paying attention to this? A, the study was done in Qatar. B, the Gulf states are disproportionately ravaged by type 2 diabetes.
Yep.
Is it at least being heated there?
They are, and I can tell you we have a big program that's going on there as well as in Kuwait. And we actually have a formal cooperative agreement with the Kuwaiti people. So at the Dasman Diabetes Institute, we have trained them. My people have been there, trained them how to do these insulin clamps and, sophisticated metabolic studies, and they take care of the patients. And we're comparing the genetic. So here's another thing that's pretty exciting that we're doing. So, and again, it's looking for genes that cause diabetes. So you eat a meal, your glucose goes up. That secretes insulin. There's amino acids in the meal. That secretes insulin. And GLP-1 goes up, and that secretes insulin. So now, when you eat a meal, there are already 3 stimuli. And now you're looking for a gene or a set of genes that might be associated with beta cell failure. When you have 3 stimuli. Now, that's going to be pretty confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So what we said, maybe what we should do is that we should do a 3-step hyperglycemic clamp. So we give you 3 steps of glucose, and we can get beta cell sensitivity to glucose. From the slope, I give you a little rise in glucose, another rise in glucose, another rise in glucose. I see how much C-peptide comes up. The slope of that curve that's beta cell sensitivity to glucose.
And then the M value is where it hits the axis?
Then I can get glucose. But this is just now I'm going to focus on the beta cell.
Okay.
Because the hyperglycemic clamp is just for beta cell function. Okay. And then after that, now I'm going to give you GLP-1 infusion. And I'm going to see how much insulin comes out. And then after that, I'm going to give you a balanced amino acid infusion. I'm going to see how much insulin comes out.
So you can sequentially measure the different
3 different stimuli.
phases.
And now what we see is different loci Some are associated with the defect in glucose.
Yep.
Some are associated with the defect in amino acid. So again, the more you can refine the phenotype, the more likely you are to identify defects that are there at the level of the beta cell.
Let's go back to the Qatar study for a second. How many people were in that study?
About 220.
Okay.
It's a pretty big study when you're doing, these insulin clamp studies and these kind of measurements are not easy to do.
That was published when?
Let's see, I would say the 1.5 year data were probably about 2018, and the 3 year data, I would say 2021, 22, something like that. I can send you all the references.
We'll link to all of these in our show notes for folks. Just simply phenomenal. Let me ask you a question. If you take an individual with type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, and you presumably collecting urinary C-peptide for 24 hours is the best surrogate for total insulin secretion?
No. Well, it's an index.
Okay. So if you could quantify total area under the curve of insulin for a person, and then you gave them a GLP-1 agonist, is total insulin going up or down?
Depends. Because you have competing factors going on here. And I'm not trying to be elusive because what I'm telling you is actually real. It's what happens. So the drug is going to kick out insulin, and C-peptide is going to go up.
Yep.
And now the glucose is going to come down.
And then you need less insulin.
And then you need less. So depending upon the relationship, okay, when you look in absolute terms, okay, the C-peptide and insulin levels actually may be lower. But now, when you express how much C-peptide comes up per the rise in glucose, huge increase, okay? So you always have to have something that you compare it to, and that's the increment in glucose. And anytime you look at how much insulin comes out, or C-peptide, which is another confusing factor, which I'll mention in a second, you always have to relate it to the glucose area. When you do that, a huge increase in beta cell function, okay? And the other thing you have to be very careful about is you need to be measuring C-peptide, not insulin. Because what we've shown is that and this is a compensatory mechanism.
Maybe just tell folks, I threw out C-peptide as though everybody knew what it is. That's a mistake. Tell people what C-peptide is and what its relationship is to insulin.
Yeah. So when you ingest a meal, there's a precursor that contains both C-peptide and insulin, proinsulin. And so you split off C-peptide and you split off insulin. And they both come out in a 1-to-1 molar ratio. The problem is half of the insulin that comes out is taken up by the liver, so you never see it in the circulating bloodstream. The C-peptide is not taken up by the liver, so everything that comes out you see in the circulation. So when we want to know how much insulin was secreted, we actually don't measure the insulin, we measure the C-peptide. And that's the true measure. Now, the other confounding feature here is, and we've shown this, and this has now been reproduced by many other people, is that when you become insulin resistant in diabetic, your beta cells don't secrete enough insulin. That's one of the big defects. How do you compensate? You don't destroy the insulin that's secreted. So the degradation of insulin becomes markedly impaired. So you can have a high insulin level either because you secrete too much insulin or because you don't destroy the insulin. So measuring the insulin level is not a good measure of beta cell function. If you want to know about insulin secretion, measure the C-peptide and express it per rise in glucose. It gets a little bit more clouded because your beta cell also can recognize how insulin resistant you are. And so it knows, look, if you're this insulin resistant, I need to secrete more insulin. If you're very insulin sensitive, like you're a lean person with normal glucose tolerance, you don't want to secrete much insulin or you get hypoglycemic. How does your beta cell recognize that? Well, that's somewhat controversial. I can give you my thoughts about it. But in either case, so measuring beta cell function is not just simply measuring insulin. That's probably bad.
Yeah.
Measuring C-peptide is better. Measuring C-peptide per rise in glucose is better. And then for some way or another, if you can express this all per insulin resistance, this is called the disposition index, something that Dr. Stephen Kahn developed with Daniel Port many, many years ago. So simply looking, as I said, as insulin or trying to do an OGTT and come up and say, you know how the beta cell is working, that's not so good. And that's why I say, well, like in the Qatar study, in the edict study, we're doing such sophisticated measures of insulin sensitivity and beta cell function. You do 350 people. That's like doing one of these big cardiovascular studies with 5,000 people in it. The pathophysiology will always tell you the truth, in my opinion. If you know what the problem is and you correct the problem, the A1C is going to get better. ADA does not emphasize pathophysiology. You know, you had Jerry Schulman on. I'm sure Jerry will tell you exactly the same. He and I think very similarly. You understand what causes a disease, and then you can come with the treatment that will make it work.
Do you have any concerns with long-term safety or anything other than simply the economics of the GLP-1s in this current generation? Again, huge leap forward between liraglutide and semaglutide.
Yeah.
And I've discussed briefly elsewhere on the podcast what the roadmap looks like for how many of these drugs are in the pipeline.
Oh, yeah.
There seems to be no end in sight. And we're going to look back at semaglutide and say, God, that thing was pedestrian.
That's what's going to happen.
So give us the bear case.
Yeah.
What should we be concerned with? What should we be at least looking out for?
Yeah. I would say overall at the present time, I would consider these drugs to be quite safe. The major issue is you have to go slow because of the GI toxicity. Where is the controversy involved? And it's something that I'm involved with myself. When you lose 20 or 30% of your body weight, you lose muscle mass, okay? Now, I just gave a talk on this to one of the pharmaceutical companies that are involved in this area. I'm not going to name the name of the pharmaceutical company, but I started off by saying, look, here's now a study with real data. This is a gastric bypass surgery study, Roux-en-Y bypass, and the people lost, I think it was 33% of their body weight, and their lean body mass came down quite significantly. One of the problems is people measure lean body mass, and that's not a real measure of muscle mass. In fact, it can be a very bad measure. You should measure muscle mass. But let's assume that the lean body mass largely reflects, it's a reasonable assumption, muscle mass. So muscle mass came down, okay? So why is that so bad?
But how much did it come down? Because if your total body mass came down by 33%,
yep.
but 3/4 of that mass was fat,
yeah.
and only 1/4 of that was lean, we would consider that acceptable.
And this is where the controversy is.
Yeah.
Because no one has really measured muscle mass.
That's right.
We're doing it. Okay. We will have a definitive answer.
And you're doing that with MRI?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So it's gold standard.
Yep.
Okay. But now I said, look, in this study, they measured absolute strength. You can do grip strength or leg strength. And absolute strength went down a little bit, okay? Maybe 25%.
Were these patients exercising during the period of their weight loss?
No.
Okay.
No. Then they said, let's express strength
as a
per weight loss.
Per weight, yeah.
Whew, up by 50%. Per appendicular, it goes up by 50%. And then they said, how far can they walk? They went from walking 200 yards to 2 miles. And then say, one of the things is how many times can you get up out of a chair in a certain period of time? It increased like 3 or 4-fold. And they measured your VO2 max.
Of course, which is heavily dependent on weight as well.
Yeah, it all got better.
But in absolute terms, did VO2 max get better? Not necessarily.
Yeah.
The total VO2, not normalized per kilogram.
No, everything got better.
Okay.
So I said, so why you guys...
That's counterintuitive, by the way.
Yeah.
Normally when you lose weight, VO2 max in liters per minute does not improve because you have less metabolic tissue.
Right. But here, for whatever the reasons are, maybe all of the fat that's pushing on your lungs so you can't oxygenate, the epicardial fat that's not allowing your heart to contract, the fat that's in the heart that's causing myocardial lipotoxicity, which I believe is real. These things are all changing in a positive way. So again, it's a balance of... Yeah. So, of course, they don't like this because... If the people, and they had all kinds of psychological questionnaires.
Wait, why weren't they happy with these results?
Well, because now the companies are all looking at developing drugs that will preserve the muscle mass or increase the muscle mass. But basically what I'm saying is that, look, there's it's lean body mass, but we have to say it's reflecting muscle mass. Yep. Everything gets better. The patient feels better. They can walk better. They feel stronger, et cetera, et cetera. Why are you so worried about muscle mass? Like, I look all these gloomy faces because they're all developing myostatin inhibitors or Aventin. And so then the next slide comes up and says, retort. Here's a good thing, okay? So now, if you lose all of this body weight and you improve insulin sensitivity in muscle, and you improve it in the heart, and there are cardiovascular benefits, and you correct the improvement in all of the cardiovascular risk factors, now, even though you've lost muscle mass, if you've improved insulin sensitivity, there may be an enormous benefit of seeing the improvement in the muscle insulin sensitivity, even though you've lost muscle mass. And they do have some concerns about these drugs, these myostatin inhibitors, that actually may have some negative effects on the heart. And my suggestion is actually you may find a big improvement in myocardial function from these.
Where are myostatin inhibitors in their development right now?
Phase 2. Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, I think we've talked about myostatin before on the podcast. When you inhibit myostatin, you increase the expression of striated muscle, of which cardiac is striated.
It works through the Aventin 2A and 2B system.
Do you think that's a more promising pathway than the follistatin pathway, where follistatin?
Yes, I do.
Increasing follistatin inhibits myostatin, but this is a more direct way to go about it.
This is a more direct way to do it. So you can either have their antibodies by Grubab to myostatin, or you can interfere with the signaling receptor itself.
And we think that this can still be effective in a fully developed and mature adult. I mean, clearly this would be effective during development, and we see that in the animal work. Yeah. How effective is it? Because a lot of the animal work is sort of a caricature stuff. It's knockouts, right? They take myostatin knockouts and they look like bodybuilders. Yeah. But if you take a mature chicken or a mouse that's 2 years old and you give it a myostatin antibody, how robust is the response?
Even more so, what about in a human?
Yeah, exactly.
We don't know the answer to that.
So what the phase 2 studies, obviously the toxicity passed in phase 1.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not concerned. There doesn't seem to be any adverse effect of these drugs, or they wouldn't have got through phase 2. And there are actually some fairly large phase 2
What's the
studies.
indication?
The indication
is it sarcopenia?
I don't know. The FDA, if you have a sarcopenic disease, there are criteria that the FDA has established if you want to develop a drug, that you have to meet certain criteria. I'm not an expert in this, so I can't tell you exactly what these criteria are, but they are pretty well established, okay? Now, for these kind of people, and I'm going to come back, you asked me about lean people, I'll come back to that in a second, because this is really an issue. Let's say I put you on a GLP-1 receptor agonist and you lost 25% of your body weight, and I put you on a myostatin inhibitor, and that prevented the muscle loss. Didn't increase it, but just prevented it. So relatively...
But that would be ridiculous. I mean, if you took a 200-pound individual who's 30% body fat, so they've got 60 pounds of adipose tissue on them. If you took 25% of their body weight off, you take them down to 150 pounds, but you're telling me potentially we prevent any deterioration of lean mass. That means they're down to 10 pounds of fat mass on a 150-pound frame.
So I'm making an assumption.
Okay.
This is pretty radical
This is remarkable.
Right. Yeah. So let's say that happened. Okay. What would be the FDA's criteria? I'm going to give you approval for this drug.
I think the FDA would ask that you've also improved function in some way.
Yes.
And the function would probably have to be determined through absolute strength, not relative strength, would be my guess.
So I don't know the answer to this question.
Because the way I think about these drugs is less about that situation. It's more in the sarcopenic adult.
This is the lean, particularly the older person.
That's right. That's right. This is the elderly individual who's sarcopenic and
Yes.
whose fall risk
Yes.
is enormous.
Yes.
And their risk of fall and morbidity and mortality is very high.
Yeah.
And in that individual, I don't think the FDA will be satisfied with simply an increase in lean body mass unless it is accompanied by strength. Now, I think that some of the tests that are used here are silly. I think the 6-minute walk test should be folded up, discarded, put in the wastebasket, and never discussed again. It is such a stupid test.
They do it all the time.
I know they do.
In cardiology.
And it just makes me want to scream.
Yeah.
We need much more rigorous tests than a 6-minute walk test. We need a test that is actually more of a submaximal test. So if we're testing cardiorespiratory fitness or some sort of peak aerobic fitness, we have to do more than walking. And if we're testing strength, I much prefer grip strength, leg extension, bench press. Again, these can be done with machines. They can be done very safely, but we really need to test strength.
Well, you see, you're raising very important and critical issues because there are many, many companies that are going ahead with these drugs that increase muscle mass. But to me, okay, increasing muscle mass, what does that mean? There needs to be some functional translation of that.
And by the way, there could be other functional benefits that exceed strength. For example, glucose disposal could be a functional
Insulin
benefit.
sensitivity, that's the one I put at the top of the list.
That's right.
Get rid of the insulin resistance. That the FDA won't give them credit for that, I don't think.
Yeah, but I think that, again, it's harder to tease out because there's more moving pieces, and they might argue there are easier ways to increase insulin sensitivity and glucose disposal. But, one way to think about this is to go back to, what if you did it the old-fashioned way? What if you got in the gym and lifted a bunch of weights?
That's been done.
Yeah, and it increases insulin sensitivity and functional strength.
Absolutely.
And so the question is, can we replicate that pharmacologically?
And that is actually exactly the way I ended my discussion to these people. I showed them what resistance training did, and if you could show what resistance training did with your muscle mass increase, then you'd have something. But you need to design the studies appropriately. And as I said, and as you said, I don't know what the criteria are going to be that the FDA uses to judge these things. They do have a sarcopenia set of criteria, but that's a very different group of people that we're talking about. Yeah. But this comes and hits home to one of the things you asked me earlier. What about the lean person who's 80 years of age? Is this the right drug for that person? I don't know. Maybe not. But now let's say you have a healthy 80-year-old person and everybody in the family lives to be 105 and they have diabetes. Well, they're at risk to, the toxic effects of hyperglycemia. Would it be reasonable to treat that person? We know there's powerful effects on the beta cell. I would say it would be quite reasonable, but I think you need to monitor what's happening to their weight and other features. Here's a bigger issue. Childhood obesity. You are obese when you're 4 years of age. You're going to be obese when you're an adult.
And your life expectancy will be significantly shorter. And your quality of life will be significantly reduced.
Now I'll make it even better. Adolescents, these young kids with diabetes, they don't respond to any of the drugs.
What is the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in under 18?
It's increasing, but I would say maybe around 4 or 5%, something like that.
1 in 20 teenagers has type 2 diabetes?
I guess I'm biased by San Antonio because we have more people with type 2 diabetes in our clinic.
But you could say potentially in San Antonio, 1 out of 20 teenagers.
It's going to be very high.
Gosh, yes. That is
staggering. And for sure, prediabetes. And I'll tell you about the prediabetes study that we did. So now, let's say and we know these studies are out there. These kids, and this big NIH-sponsored study, they don't respond to metformin sulfonylureas. They don't respond to any drugs very well.
Even the GLP-1 agonists?
The first study has just come out. They respond better. It's a liraglutide study. They don't have any of the two.
But if you just clinically, if you're in the clinic and you're treating them without, you're using the best drugs you have available.
You're in trouble. And we know.
Wait, why?
Because you can't get them controlled.
Why?
They're so insulin resistant, much more so than adults. These are well-published studies.
Is this not so much Is the causality here not? Is this really a selection bias where for someone to develop type 2 diabetes as a 16-year-old, the underlying genetics and pathology are so severe that the current crop of drugs are the problem, as opposed to when you take the current crop of drugs and you apply them to people who are young, they don't work?
All three, because I'm going to add one more. Genetic predisposition. So Hispanic population,
Yes.
Huge problem. Obesity, all of these kids are huge, okay?
So you don't have the lean diabetic phenotype in this age
No, not
group.
in these people. And then the drugs don't work very well in this. So all three of these things. And what now has come, it's called the RISE study. As these kids have been followed up, they're starting to develop kidney disease. They're even, I'm told, a couple of people have had MIs in their 20s. They're incredibly difficult to control.
What do you think? I mean, yes, we're going to argue that these kids that this is due to what they're eating, but what is it in the environment that is so obesogenic to these kids?
I'll come back to this in a second, but I want to raise the issue now. Let's say you're 16 and you know metformin, these drugs are not, your A1C is 9. You could put someone on Mounjaro, and they're going to have to take this for the rest of their life. Because as soon as you stop the drug,
goes away.
So this is what I treat the person. Of course, I can't let the A1C at 9.
But if you take that 16-year-old with a hemoglobin A1C of 9 and you give them Mounjaro, where are they in a year?
I think that if they can afford the drug and they stay on the drug, the three big ifs, if the doctor knows what to do, I know what to do. If the patient will cooperate with you. If you don't, they'll lose every time. And if they can afford. If you can satisfy those three Fs, that person, we know from the studies, will be pretty well controlled.
And insurance, what fraction of insured patients will have coverage on Mounjaro if their A1C is 9?
I can't answer that. But
does CMS cover it? Does Medicaid cover that?
Yes, if you have diabetes.
Okay.
I don't know. The Mounjaro coverage, I think, is pretty good if you have diabetes. Okay. If you have obesity, that's a different. If you have obesity without, that's a whole different issue.
Yep.
Should you be treating these young kids who are obesity is a disease? Okay, it's got all kinds of problems. Should you put these young kids on these newer drugs, and knowing that all I did is change you from food addiction to drug addiction? I didn't do anything else. It's almost like alcohol addiction, okay? There are drugs, there are things I can give you that can help you, but they tend to relapse. Food addiction, I put you on the drug, you lose weight. You stop the drug, you regain the weight. This is a huge public health concern. It is almost way beyond my capacity because finances are involved here. Can we afford to treat 42% of the people in the U.S. are obese? Or is there some way amongst the 42% we can define who are the people who are insulin resistant? Who are the people who have the metabolic syndrome that we know they're at risk, that we can treat them? My guess is that's the great majority of that 42% of the people. Can we treat all of those people? And moreover, they're going to stay on the drug. We know, on average, what the data is saying, I put you on the drug. We don't know all the reasons why, but within a year, half of the people stop the drug.
Yeah, and it's probably a combination of cost and side effects.
Yeah, and my patients very commonly tell me, say, Ralph, I enjoy eating, and I can't eat anymore. And some people just tell me they just want to eat, and so I'm going to get fat again, so I'm going to eat. Some is GI side effects, and some is cost. $1,000 a month is a lot of money for.
It's insane.
Yeah, for people.
So, Ralph, again, I just kind of bring it back to this question, which, I mean, everybody wants to understand this, which is what has changed so much in the last 30 years that has created this epidemic? And, everybody has their favorite pet theory for what it is. It's the sugar, it's the carbs, it's the plastics, it's the video games, it's the internet, it's the whatever. Perhaps suggesting that it's many, many things. What is your best explanation for what's going on?
I would say all of the above. Processed foods, calorically dense foods, lack of exercise are critical. But these are, I would say, the stimuli that has done something. that's changed the neurocircuitry in the brain. So yes, there's a stimulus, and because now you've been oversubscribed to these stimuli, that's now initiated a process in the brain, which is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is something that I'm very interested in, Dr. Peter Fox and I at the Health Science Center. But if you go through the literature, and we've published on this as well, in the areas of the brain that control food intake, and I'm not talking about the hypothalamus, that kind of regulates your basal energy intake, what you need to keep your BMI of 25, do what you do during the day. But what is it that makes your BMI go to 35? That's all related to the hedonic areas in the brain, the putamen, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, etc. And then when you do structural MRI, what you can show is that those areas in the brain, the gray matter is shrunk down. And if you now map the neurocircuitry, which Peter Fox has been involved with, you can see that there's clear disruption using functional MRI of the neurocircuitry in the brain. We have a particular interest in defining where this dysfunction occurs, and we have some ideas, which I'm not going to go into, but how we might be able to sort of reprogram the brain. And sort of in concert with this, these are not data, but these are data that are published in the literature. And I think I mentioned this earlier. If you do an insulin clamp, okay, I told you that in your eye, your brain doesn't respond by taking up glucose. But in people who are obese, actually almost in proportion to how obese you are, in these areas in the brain, the hedonic areas, there's a marked increase in, it's called fluorodeoxyglucose, which is the PET radioisotope tracer we use in these areas. And that correlates inversely with the muscle insulin resistance.
The more insulin resistant they are in the muscle, the more FDG glucose
uptake there is in the brain. Now, this is very interesting because what it's saying, there's a connection. That somehow or another, we believe that the brain is talking to the muscle, or the muscle is talking to the brain, and that somehow or other, the brain is playing a very important role in the development of the insulin resistance, and that in large part, that this deranged neurocircuitry, which is related to food intake, is now making you overeat. And as you overeat, then all of the things that we know, that we've studied, that other people have studied, that go with lipotoxicity, you put fat in the muscle, you're insulin resistant. You put fat in the liver, you got NASH and NAFL. What people have totally overlooked, you put fat in the kidney, you get kidney disease. You put fat in your arteries.
Heart. Yeah. So you've been in San Antonio since the late 80s. When did you really start to notice this was a problem, at least in your community?
Almost instantaneously, because I run the Texas...
Even in kids?
Even in kids. It was very clear.
So we can't blame video games. We can't blame social media because that wasn't going on in the late 80s. So
I never saw fat kids at Yale. I was on the faculty from 75 to 88, and I kind of thought back. Now, I would say New Haven's not a large Hispanic, but it's more African-American. But I don't remember seeing, 12-year-old kids with type 2 diabetes. And when I came here, and I remember this very distinctly, they're saying, you're crazy. You don't see kids with type 2 diabetes. Believe me, I see them.
And what did your colleagues at San Antonio tell you as far as when they started to notice that in the Hispanic kids?
I think they just, I don't know that I can give you a specific time that they told me, except they knew it.
But so, okay, what about in non-Hispanic kids? Because if the Hispanic kids are genetically predisposed to this, then the question becomes, when did you begin to see this in African-American kids and Caucasian kids?
Yeah, so we don't have a large African-American population here. But like in Philadelphia, there's a lady, Silva Arslavian, she sees the same thing. And she sees, I think it's a significant African-American population. So I think that in certain ethnic minorities where the genes for diabetes are enriched, that those are the populations that are predisposed.
And do you think this is mostly an energy balance issue and therefore it's mostly a food environment issue?
No, I think it's both. So I told you I'd come back to the genetic study that we did. So an Italian fellow was with me, Giovanni Gulli, a long, long time ago here in San Antonio. We wanted to know what is the earliest defect that you can see in people who are going to develop type 2 diabetes. So we said, okay, in the Hispanic community, it's very common to see mom and dad with diabetes. And it's very common to see a lot of children in these families. So we said, why don't we go look at the children? And let's see if we can define, because they're at high risk.
Yeah.
And if you have mom and dad with diabetes, you probably have a 70-80% chance if you're Hispanic, if you're born in that family, developing diabetes. It was very easy to find the children. The problem was we couldn't find lean children. So it took us a while, because if you're obese, then you got the lipotoxicity. So we finally found them. This is a JCI paper, I believe. And so we did insulin clamp. They're as resistant as their parents. They have normal glucose tolerance. Why? Because their insulin levels are astronomical. And then we do a muscle biopsy.
How high, just for understanding?
Oh, they're like two times normal, even higher sometimes. We do a muscle biopsy. The same defect in the insulin signaling pathway.
How many of the tyrosine kinase defects do they have?
They have, starts at IRS1. Insulin binding to the receptor is okay, just like their parents. The ability to activate the insulin signaling pathway at the level of IRS1, it's already well established.
Which enzyme in particular?
It starts at the level of IRS1.
Starts at the first one?
Yeah.
Oh, so it's not just one enzyme, though?
Well, no, it's IRS1, you can't tyrosine phosphorylate it.
Got it.
You cannot activate PI3
I see.
kinase.
Okay, so it starts at IRS1.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then the other thing, Jerry and I have both done this in somewhat different ways. Jerry, I'm talking about Jerry Schulman. He uses NMR by looking at phosphate derivatives, even though I believe the primary defect is in the signaling pathway. There's clearly severe impairments in glucose transport and phosphorylation. His work would suggest that the primary defect is at the level of glucose transport. We developed a novel triple tracer technique using 3 isotopes infused into the brachial artery. We believe that the primary defect is at the level of hexokinase and phosphorylating glucose. So we kind of agree to disagree, because we can't do the study, and we'd have to do the MRI study at the same time we're doing the triple tracer technique. In addition to the insulin signaling defect, there's a severe defect in glucose transport and phosphorylation.
Once, let's just make sure people understand this is we're kind of getting into some biochemistry here.
Yeah.
When glucose enters the cell passively through
it goes
the GLUT4 transporter.
GLUT4 transporter.
Yep.
And it gets free glucose in the cell.
Yes.
Then to metabolize it,
you have to put a phosphate. The first step to that is hexokinase, which takes a phosphate off ATP and puts it on the 6th position, if I'm not mistaken.
And it's a specific type of hexokinase, so it's hexokinase 2.
Yeah, because there's a different one in the muscle and the liver, correct?
And that is correct.
Yep.
So Jerry would say the primary defect is in GLUT4, the transporter.
Yes.
I would say, yes, that is severely impaired, but even more severe.
Remind me what Jerry believes is wrong with the GLUT4 transporter?
That it doesn't work normally.
I thought it worked fine. It's just not getting the signal to work because of IRS1.
That's where the controversy is. How do you, when you have a severe, we were the first to show this defect in muscle. In fact, we're the only people, I think, that have shown this in human muscle. It's been shown in rats, etc. To me, metabolism in rats and mice is so different. This is all people data, okay?
So you're saying, but it's possible that just having the IRS1 problem is enough. It's also possible that even if IRS1 is functioning reasonably, if GLUT4 is not getting up, that's the problem.
There is evidence to support that.
And then it's also possible that even if all those things work, if you don't get hexokinase to phosphorylate glucose, you back up the whole system.
And I can show you there's a primary defect in pyruvate dehydrogenase in glycogen synthase. This comes back. I have an ominous octet for the insulin resistance, okay? This is why people don't understand. Look, there are 8 organ sort of things that are a problem. There are 8 problems I can show you within the muscle. Why do you think one drug is going to correct all these problems? We need drugs to work on the beta cell. We need insulin sensitizers. We probably need different types of insulin sensitizing drugs. We need drugs that reverse the lipotoxicity. Will we ever have a single magic bullet that corrects all of these? Probably not. I think until we discover the genetic basis, and remember I said that diabetes is a heterogeneous disease. And I did, in diabetes metabolism reviews, I would say 30 years ago, I wrote a review article that said, I can put a defect in the muscle and reproduce diabetes. I can put a defect in the liver and reproduce diabetes. I can put a defect in the fat cell and reproduce diabetes. I can put a defect in the beta cell and reproduce diabetes. And I went back and read that, and I said, I can put a defect that starts in the brain and reproduce diabetes. So we see someone with an A1C of 8 or 9. All these defects we've been talking about, they're already there.
So you put that defect in the fat cell, they can look lean. And
there's a syndrome called Alzheimer's syndrome. There's a specific defect in this is white adipocyte. There's this, Phil Scherer will love me for saying this. He's the top guru in adipocyte metabolism up in Dallas. It's Alzheimer's syndrome. There's a specific defect in the glucose transporter in white adipose tissue. You know what happens? You become diabetic. You know what happens? You gain weight. You know what happens? You get NASH. So here's a defect that I said 30 years ago. I just postulated and said, here's a syndrome. And not only that, now that they define this in people in this paper, they then went to the animal model and they knocked out the gene that's causing the defect, and they reproduced diabetes in the normal rat model, mouse model.
So, Ralph, I want to close by bringing it back to something that people can do to help understand if they're at risk, either lean or otherwise. We talked about it at the outset, but didn't go into it in detail, which is the OGTT, the oral glucose tolerance test. Now, again, none of us have the privilege of being able to use a euglycemic clamp, both clinically as physicians or as experience it as patients. So we're going to have to kind of rely on other things. We're going to have to rely on body fat. We're going to have to rely on triglycerides. We're going to have to rely on hemoglobin A1C, although I find that to be a particularly useless metric.
Not that useless, but
at the individual level, I find it very unhelpful. I think at the population level, it's great, and in deltas, it's great. But boy, the correlation between hemoglobin A1C and realized glucose levels, it's pretty weak. But let's talk about the OGTT, because this is not a test that is done frequently. I believe it should be. And I'd love to have you walk us through the interpretation of the following. I'm going to give you a couple scenarios. So case one, I'm making this up as we go. So you got a person who starts out, all these people are going to start out normal. Okay. They're going to start out with a glucose of 90 and an insulin of 6. Okay. At 30 minutes, this is after 75 grams of oral glucose. The insulin rises to 90.
I'm nervous.
The glucose rises to 130. At 60 minutes, the glucose is down to 100. The insulin is down to 60. And we'll just do one more check at 2 hours. The glucose at this point is 60. And the insulin is 20.
That is a pre-diabetic state. This is a very insulin-resistant person. And 2 hours later, hypoglycemia is a reflection of the beta cells' early insulin secretion. This is kind of a pre-diabetic state.
And so agree with you completely, and we see this all the time, Ralph. This is a person, by the way, with a perfectly normal hemoglobin A1C. And this is a person who gets passed all the time as totally normal.
You're severely insulin resistant.
Because your glucose is 90, your hemoglobin A1C is normal, and your insulin is 6, even if the doctor is checking insulin. But as you point out, the thing that trips you off is not their glucose. 90 to 130 to 100 is amazing. It's 90 was how high the insulin was at 30 seconds.
Correct.
And of course, they overshot, which is why they become hypoglycemic.
Yes.
Okay.
Well known.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go another one. This person also starts at 90 and 6. At 30 minutes, they go to 180.
Yeah.
Insulin goes to 30.
Yeah.
At 60 minutes, they go to 200. Insulin is 40.
They're diabetic. We showed
But just to be clear, this is a person, these are almost real cases, by the way. This is a person whose hemoglobin A1C is 5.6.
Got it. We already published this.
Yep.
The best predictor of who's going to get diabetes is a 1 hour glucose greater than 155. And this is from prospective data from the San Antonio Heart Study, also from the Botnia study, where these people have been followed up. We were the first people to publish this, I'd say 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. There have been, I'd say, at least 15 to 20 studies that have reproduced what we showed 10 years ago.
So
if
1 hour glucose is more than 155,
you're in trouble.
And that's a great predictor of type 2 diabetes, regardless of all the other metrics.
Yes. And if you also happen to be hyperinsulinemic, that adds more to the predictive value. But just pick 155 without knowing the insulin. That's a huge predictor of whether you're going to develop diabetes or not. That's from the San Antonio Heart Study, and that's also from the Botnia study, and also from our Vegas study.
Okay.
So,
next case, I'm not even going to give you the numbers, I'll just describe it. This is a person who has a delayed onset of insulin. So in other words, they start out normal at 90.
30-minute insulin is deficient. That's a predictor as well.
Yes. So what's going on in this person where 30-minute insulin does nothing, glucose rises, and then at an hour and 90 minutes, the pancreas kicks on and starts to dispose of glucose. What's happening in that person?
That's a primary beta cell defect, and one of the earliest things you can detect in people who are predisposed to develop diabetes is loss of first-phase insulin secretion. Now, first-phase insulin secretion is, strictly speaking, can only be measured with the hyperglycemic clamp that we developed. So when I acutely raise the glucose from, say, 90 and I raise it to 200, in the first 10 minutes, there's a big spike of insulin that comes out. That is typically lost in people who are going to develop type 2 diabetes. In its counterpart during the OGTT is the insulin level at 30 minutes. Okay. So when you ingest the glucose, of course, the rise in glucose is more gentle. When I acutely raise your glucose from 90 to 200, that big spike of glucose gives the first phase. But a low insulin response in the first 30 minutes is another predictor of who's going to get into trouble.
We use the following numbers in our practice as what we consider what we want to see. Do you think we're being too aggressive? At time 0, we want to see you less than 90 and less than 6. At time 30 minutes, we want to see you less than 140 and less than 40. At time 60 minutes, we want to see you less than 130 and less than 30. And at 2 hours, we want to see you less than, at 90 minutes, we want to see you less than 110 and less than 20. Do you think we're being too hard?
Yeah, you might be being overly aggressive. But for sure, if they meet those numbers, you're probably safe.
Ralph, I don't know where the time went today, but it went. And this was a fascinating discussion. I could talk about this stuff all day long. And it's interesting because someone listening to this podcast who heard the podcast with Jerry Schulman from probably 3 years ago will be pleased because the overlap is virtually zero, right? I mean, that's what's amazing about a topic as rich as this, is you can talk to two of the world's experts and have two completely different conversations. The conversation with Jerry focused so much on the pathophysiology of insulin resistance. Here we focused much more on the actual organ-specific aspect of type 2 diabetes. We got a masterclass in the pharmacology of it, and then I think kind of brought it back to ways to diagnose it if you're slumming it with those of us in the clinic who don't have clamps.
So maybe we should, in the future, we do one with both Jerry and I.
I will 100% agree that in a few years we come back and we do a double version of this, and that would be fantastic. Yeah,
I sign up.
All right, Ralph, thank you so much. Not just obviously for this, but for your contribution to this field.
Okay, I appreciate it. This was wonderful.